Okay, so you probably knew by now that Invincible was a series based on a comic by the same guy who did The Walking Dead, and if you didn't, surprise! Now, maybe you've seen a panel or two from these comics, but if you've read them from front to back like I have, you won't even recognize the TV series, and I'm gonna talk about it for a bit. The Invincible series was an indie production starring Mr. Whiplash and Glenn Rhee, written by the dude who wrote The Walking Dead. I'm obviously kidding, it was not an indie production. It actually had a budget of $10 million per episode, which is like making the movie Clerks 363 times for every episode. Season 1 got a 98% and a 93% on Rotten Tomatoes and spawned a litany of memes, most memorably, "Think, Mark!" And my favorite being,
"Let me break it down for you, Mark."
Season 1 came out on Amazon Prime in 2021, and another season came out in 2023. With the recent release of Season 3, I thought it was a good time to talk about not only how the show is so massively different from the comics, but perhaps why it was so different as well. To the best of my omniscient knowledge, that is. Just kidding, I just watch a lot of movies. To be very clear, I'm going to go into extreme detail about the specificities of the comics and compare them to the show in this video. So if you haven't seen Invincible yet, why are you here? I recommend watching it, even if it's just the first episode, because woof, the ending of that first episode is like nearly peak of the entire show. So I'm gonna break this video up into a few sections. For each episode, I'm going to give a quick summary of what happened on the screen, then I'm going to talk about how each scene was adapted from the comics, if it was adapted at all. Going chronologically is going to be really hard because this stuff is not even close to lining up. Then, after the comic comparison, I'm going to talk about the narrative and thematic differences between the two versions, trying my best to explain why I think they took place and which one is stronger. Also diving into some behind-the-scenes reasoning when possible. Also themes, because those are fun. Alright, let's do this.
It's about time.
Okay, so before we get started with the episode itself, it's important to put a good cap on where things start and where they end. The show adapts issues 1 to 13 into its first season, with the last line of the show being, "Finish high school, I guess." With that also being the very last panel of issue number 13. While adapting 13 comic issues into 18 episodes seems like a simple fit, because this is a Kirkman show, there's quite a bit of remixing that takes place. And it all happens at a much faster pace. Just keep in mind that there's going to be a lot of jumping around, as the comics aren't exactly as straight of a line as the show is. With that said, the episode begins with two unsuspecting security guards standing outside the White House. They're talking about their lives when the Mauler twins bust out and reveal that they're clones of each other and their whole gimmick. They approach the White House but are stopped by the Guardians of the Globe, Earth's mightiest heroes. Wait, that's another franchise. Earth's most familiar heroes. I word it that way because they're obvious parodies of other superheroes, but you can take that up with the source material. Quick rundown. Red Rush, Flash or Quicksilver ripoff, mostly Flash. War Woman, Wonder Woman but with a mace instead of a sword. Aquarius, Aquaman, except more like Man Aqua. Martian Man, Martian Manhunter from DC, but doesn't hunt men, just these Mauler twins. Green Ghost, mix between Green Lantern and Vision from Marvel. Immortal is Immortal. Darkwing, Batman except with hockey pads. Which kinda makes Omni-Man the Superman-like, except without the ice breath or laser vision. Anyway, the fight ends with the Guardians demolishing the Mauler twins and the camera match-cutting to Mark sitting on the toilet reading comics. His mother busts in, and the show establishes that they're obviously very close. Only slightly later are we downstairs where Mark watches the fight on TV. You know, the White House. Kind of a big deal.
They rebuild that thing twice a year at this point.
Or not.
We've rebuilt it before. We'll rebuild it again.
Omni-Man returns home and is very affectionate with Deborah, Mark's mom. Mark leaves for school, but not before Omni-Man reveals that Mark will develop his own superpowers very soon. As Mark leaves for school, he tries to break in his new shoes by attempting to fly upwards. He's very impatient for those new powers to kick in. We then get to school where we meet Mark's best and very gay friend William. They talk about the White House and it's made very obvious that no one knows about the secret identity portion of Mark's life. William calls him an omni-maniac, always supporting the underdog.
Big fan of the Yankees, are you?
We overhear Bully Todd harassing Amber, where she presents herself as an obviously very witty is the word, I think? Socially aware, something like that. Mark sticks up for her, which results in him getting his shit kicked in, then Amber sticking up for him right back, right in the jewels. She says thanks. Then we're right outside where Mark works, Burger Mart, where he accidentally realizes that he has powers by hurling a garbage bag into space. Next up, Mark tells his dad about his powers and how they came in. His dad is kind of unresponsive, and Debbie kind of kicks him into being proud. Nolan says that he'll be starting his training tomorrow morning. One restless night later, Mark flashes back to when his dad told him where he really came from. The planet Viltrum, a perfect society where when Viltrumites become of age, they venture out into the galaxy and help lesser developed worlds. Nolan volunteered to venture to Earth, and that's where he met Debbie. It ends with young Mark getting excited about being able to fly, and then older Mark taking his first test flight during the night. After accidentally spending all night flying on his own, his dad wakes him up early to actually learn a little bit from him. They spend a little bit of time flying together, Mark coming along really well, and Nolan gives a rather human interaction about peeing your pants on purpose. It's rather cute. It's all looking good, and then Nolan transitions to some fight lessons. We get a bit of tough love training from Omni-Man when he punches Mark in the gut. Man doesn't even flinch either, look at that stare.
And that mustache.
He gives him a reality check about nobody pulling their punches, and they go home. Nolan kind of regrets Mark getting his powers at all, and he says that very loudly as Mark hears. The scene ends with Nolan getting rather snippy with Debbie, which she says is rather unlike him. We get back to school where Todd tries to get revenge, but Mark goes a bit dark masochistic and asks him to do so. It goes about as well as you expect. Mark then goes into the city with a makeshift costume and tries to stop a robbery. It goes well, with Mark trying on different names until he takes down Titan. For now, he's...
I guess I'm working on that. Any suggestions?
Omni-Man finds him and tells him that he looks absolutely ridiculous. But I'll be honest, he's kind of got like the Scarlet Spider vibe going, and I kind of like it. Mark and Nolan talk on a rooftop, and he gets a bit masochistic again, where Mark is desperate to prove to his dad that he was made for this. If only he knew how true that was. Instead of being a cold-hearted dude, Nolan and him have a rather sweet moment together. Nolan instead takes him to the tailor, where we meet Art, voiced by the wonderful Mark Hamill. Mark has a very childish whimsy about him getting his own costume, and it's pulled over really wonderfully by Steven Yeun. Luke Skywalker here tries to put him in Bulletproof's costume.
Can't blame a guy for trying to move unsold merchandise.
Mark doesn't like it and instead wants something more iconic. The Joker says that's what everyone says, but he is willing to put in the work based on who his dad is. Then it's nighttime. Mark is practicing his landings, which basically just means he's slamming into the ground at
unsafe velocities.
And his mother comes out and talks to him about it. She tries to parent him, and we have this really fantastic interaction from somebody who's dealt with superpowered people in her life for a long time.
Make me.
Does that make you feel strong? To know I can't physically make you do something? Is that what you need?
Boom. Roasted.
After this brilliant bit of writing, Debbie has a sit with Mark and talks about how she can still connect with her son, despite not soaring through the clouds with him. She's worried about losing touch with her son, and you can see it. Mark and Nolan do some more training, catch in the backyard, except where Nolan has a very human interaction with his son, telling him that it's natural to doubt himself, but if he can push through, he can do anything and really be a hero. And that
You're gonna need to do things you don't want to do, or might not think you can do.
yeah, hold on to that one, kiddies. Mark seems happy, throwing the ball to his dad again. Nolan then kind of name drops him as Invincible for the first time. Mark then goes to Art, saying that he's got his concept. He gets his suit, he beats down on Callin for the first time, calling himself the namesake of the show, which, a solid 9 out of 10 for an Invincible title drop. It's iconic and has roots in the comics, as you'll see later. S tier so far. And we roll some credits. Oh, but the episode's not over yet. We get a fun teaser on every member of the Guardians of the Globe. War Woman, Green Ghost, Red Rush, everybody gets their 60 seconds of spotlight. It's wonderful and wholesome and cute. Their days get cut short when they all get called back to Guardians HQ for some reason. Nobody's quite sure who put out the signal, so as they all get there to figure it out... Yeah, Omni-Man comes in and crushes all of them with relative ease. Martian Man, War Woman, and the Immortal put up a fight, but Nolan dispatches them all without a word, succumbing to some injuries as well and passing out. The Guardians die, Nolan's unconscious, episode over.
You actually are invincible.
I think it'll be fun to begin every one of these comic sections with an explanation of where the title comes from. So the first episode title, It's About Time, comes from issue number 1, in the exact same place as it does in the show, when he throws the Burger Mart trash bag into orbit. Now, generally speaking, the scenes from the Invincible show come from somewhere in the comics. Where is a different question, and it's usually non-sequential with the surrounding scenes. With that said, I'll be going through each scene in the show and trying to explain if it's a show exclusive or a comic adaptation. So starting us off, the very first scene is actually a show exclusive. There isn't an attack on the White House by the Muller twins that is stopped by the Guardians of the Globe and then Omni-Man. There actually isn't anything even close because the issue that introduces the Guardians, issue number 7, has them all acting as individuals, not as a group. This also means that the scenes where they talk about the White House attack also aren't in the comics, although in issue number 1, there is a scene of Mark watching the news to reveal that Omni-Man is fending off an attack in Taiwan. Mark sitting on the toilet to start his day is ripped from the comics, and the comic that Mark is reading is called Science Dog, while in the show it's called Seance Dog. The scenes in the school introducing Amber also don't exist. There isn't really a scene dedicated to Amber's introduction in the comics at all, actually. At least not to that extent. The closest we get is when Amber drops her number into Mark's hand in issue number 8. And yes, this blonde white girl is Amber. She isn't black in the comics, who cares, moving on. The scene of Mark unlocking his powers happens later in issue number 1, as well as the scene of him telling his father at the dinner table. Although no one really reacts at all in the comics, which I guess plays into the whole, yeah, superheroes are a thing, please pass potatoes kind of vibe it has going to it. This scene where Mark is laying awake in bed said is taken from two sources. One is from issue number 1, where he jumps off the roof assuming he can fly, and the other is in issue number 2, when Nolan talks to him about his Viltrumite origins. That's how issue number 2 opens, by the way. It's still a dream and it goes down almost in the exact same way. Some of the words can even be overlaid, so...
Okay, son. You may have noticed that I'm not like normal dads. Your mother and I think it's time you knew the truth. We think you're old enough for me to tell you where I really come from. Millions of miles from here, out in deep space, is the planet Viltrum, a cool blue oasis alone in a solar system much like our own. I was born on this planet. Viltrumites are very similar to humans, except we can fly, move at super speed, and possess great strength. When our people come of age, we leave Viltrum and venture out into the galaxy. I volunteered to relocate to Earth and be its sole protector.
There's some extra panels in the comic about the process that happens when the World Betterment Committee selects a planet to help. The comics also have more panels about Nolan's first impression of Earth, notably being intrigued by the individuality of humans. There's also a crossover of him mentioning
how I met your mother.
I know this is a lot to take in at one time. You're getting older. Things are going to start to change for you in a few years as you hit puberty. You're going to get acne. Your voice will start to crack as it begins to change. You'll begin to grow hair in strange places. And you're going to start to develop superpowers of your own. Super strength and speed, flight, the whole bit. Do you understand?
I'm gonna be able to fly?
I'm gonna be able to fly.
Okay, that last line was kinda close enough. It gets a bit remixy from that point, but him saying screw it is from when he says screw this in the comics and flies away. In the comics, that's actually where he encounters the Mahler twins for the first time, but in the show, he tries to fly on his own at night, which there's no comic equivalent for. He's pretty damn good at flying on his own for the first time in the comics. The specific lessons on flying are show exclusive, but Nolan telling him that he's far better than he should be comes from when the two team up. I said team up. During that team up though, Invincible has his costume already because he got it at the end of issue number 1. There's no practice fighting lessons either, those are show exclusive. There's actually shockingly little training that happens in the comic between Nolan and his son. The closest we get is only after Nolan makes his return to the comics in issue number 25. The scene of Nolan saying maybe life would be better if Mark didn't get his powers at all is a show exclusive as well, and nearly all interaction between Debbie and Nolan is a show exclusive, as they had very little interaction before Chicago in the comics. The scene of Mark letting Todd hit him is a show exclusive. Todd himself is almost a show exclusive character, making his one and only appearance in issue number 1, and he's not even picking on Mark in the panels, although Mark does stand up for the defenseless nerd that he is picking on. The establishing shot of Mark flying around aimlessly in the city is a show exclusive, but the Titan robbery isn't. It follows the same event in issue number 1 pretty close to the letter, except Titan makes it a point to mention that the bullets hurt him in the comics. Who the hell are you is a panel in the comics, but Mark's response is a show exclusive. A good one if you ask me. Omni-Man's
You look ridiculous.
has the same spirit as his comics response, what in God's name are you wearing? In the comics, Omni-Man immediately takes him to his tailor after this part, while in the show they have a conversation about Mark being ready, which is a show exclusive. There isn't a lot of time in the comics to process this kind of pressure we put on Mark. Art's line of
Prom dresses by day, indestructible supersuits by night
is taken 1-to-1 from the comics. Okay, more like 0.99 to 1, same thing. But nearly the entire rest of the conversation is different. Something notable is that in the comics, he doesn't introduce himself, so he's just the tailor. Mark's dislike of the orange and yellow is the same as the comics, although he describes it in different ways each time. The part about wanting an iconic suit is also from the comics, but nearly all different words. The conversation he has with his mother is also absent from the comics, although we do get some overlap in the form of heartfelt conversations in issues 4, 8, 9, and a handful of other places, but those are the bulk of them before Chicago. Nolan and Mark throwing the ball together happens in issue number 6, but the circumstances are different. For one, Invincible has his costume already. He gets it in issue number 1. Keep up in the back of the class, please. For 2, in the comics, it's about Mark calling Nolan dad after he gets taken prisoner by the Flaxons, which happens in issue number 3, in case you were wondering. More on that later. Whereas in the show, they talk about being afraid, which is a show exclusive. Mark doesn't have any conversations like this in the comics. Nolan giving Mark his name is also a show exclusive. Mark does receive some inspiration from his principal, though, after he gets in a fight with that bully. The scene where Mark returns to Art to tell him that he's got a name is a show exclusive, as is his first flight in the city, and the scene where he's fighting Callin has the same spirit as when he's fighting some thugs in the first issue. He doesn't actually fight Callin in the comics, but it does have the same spirit as when he name drops himself as Invincible. Promise I won't do that like 12 more times. No, I don't. I'm a liar. Alright, guys.
Hang on to your turban, kid.
Because the scene of Omni-Man killing the Guardians actually happens in issue number 7. Not quite episode 1 like the show would have you believe. In the comics, Red Rush and Olga talk about her coworker's stapler, not Aquarius, but he does sneak away literally between words to stop Kursk. He does also stop the mugging of an old lady and the return of a cat from a tree. The conversation is very different and it feels much more intimate in the show, whereas in the comics they just talk about her work and having lunch with Red Rush. Quick aside about the costume differences, he's got boots in the comics. Look at this snappy dresser. The Immortal scene is basically the same as the comics, albeit shorter. Although in the comics, the Vulture guy does make a point to mention that he's got cancer and only a little bit to live. Actually, he also laced his suit with uranium, not plutonium, so when in doubt, throw him into space is definitely an Immortal one-liner though. Aquarius' intro is actually, unironically, the closest one-to-one in the comic adaptation we see in the entire show. Not kidding, nothing to say about it, it's exactly the same. Although the show makes it up with War Woman, which doesn't even take the spirit of her scene into account. Not to be mean, just to be honest. In the comic, War Woman is waking up with her lover, a woman by the way, who does look a lot like the woman she's fighting with in the show, and she gets intercepted by this rock golem looking thing, trying to drag her back to her home realm. She fights it and gets called away to Guardians HQ. Her job or career isn't even alluded to in the comics at all, just the romance that her and her lover share. Except for one panel way later in the comics when the GDA assumes control of the Guardians HQ, and they mention that it was privately funded by War Woman and Darkwing. Her costume also got New 52'd in the show, and it looks much more historical in the comics. The only real similarity is at the end they both fly away to Guardians HQ. The scene with Martian Man doesn't have any kind of comic counterpart. Martian Man himself doesn't even look like his comic self. He's brown, not green. His costume is purple and yellow, not magenta and blue. Yes, purple and magenta are different colors, check a color wheel. And there's no reference for this Nikki kid in the comics. The scene with Green Ghost taking pictures of a model is also a show exclusive. There's nothing anywhere even similar. Now, the reason these scenes are both show exclusives are because the scene that does introduce Martian Man and Green Ghost in the comics puts them both teaming up taking down some space robot. In the comics, it's very clear that Green Ghost has only been Green Ghost for about a month, chosen as his successor. The show has Green Ghost eat this little gemstone thing, while in the comics it's much more ooey gooey. In the show, I think he is a she.
And I think she's a changeling.
Or the Green Ghost is much more male presenting in the comics. Leave me alone, Twitter. Darkwing's scene changes quite a bit. For starters, they give more context about Midnight City, which in the show is reserved more for season 2, which is fine, I guess. And before we even get into the scene, just look at these character designs. Imagine having such unique character designs for thugs in your city and instead using Jesse Pinkman and Tony Stark. Disgraceful. The two thugs talk less about Darkwing and more about the world building of Midnight City itself, and Darkwing gets the jump on them. Not quite the Batman-esque hiding in the shadows. In the show, he's also what the comic Darkwing would call a chatterbox. His dialogue is also cheesy. I don't know, man. The show definitely lands some uniqueness with his arsenal. These magnetic handcuff things are miles ahead of the bolus he's using in the comics. There's no interrogation, but the wing jet jump off the building is spot on. Also, didn't know where else to throw this, but Darkwing appears lighter in the comics. I'm not sure if I'd call him white necessarily, but he definitely isn't Lenny James Black. That's the actor, not a racism. And lastly, the order in which the heroes are revealed gets all switched around. In the show, it goes Red Rush, Immortal, Aquarius, War Woman, Martian Man, Green Ghost, and Darkwing. The comics have it as Darkwing, Red Rush, War Woman, Aquarius, Martian Man, and Green Ghost, and Immortal, with Immortal being the one flying into Guardians HQ. Speaking of, in the comics the base is somewhere in Utah, while in the show it looks like they're on some snowy mountain somewhere. Anyway, the order makes Martian Man and Green Ghost the only overlap as far as positions go. Not really that important, especially since the comics made this the first time we saw these heroes, but the show had the attack on the White House. Here's something neat. The first people to die in the comics was Aquarius being slammed into Red Rush, but in the show, Omni-Man's first punch is at Immortal. So if Red Rush hadn't pushed him out of the way, that would have changed too. Now in the comics, sorry to say, this fight is over extremely quickly. One page quickly. Omni-Man just uses his super speed to kill them all before they even know who it is, except Immortal, who he says never liked him, and Nolan responds with the feeling was mutual. Nolan says nothing in the show, but in the comics he has that one line. And that's the end.
Regardless, it's him or us.
So let's start at the end and then I'll circle around to the beginning and go scene by scene again. Probably the biggest difference between the two mediums for maybe the entire show is that Omni-Man kills the Guardians at the end of the first episode instead of issue number 7. Now, this places the entirety of season 1 in a world without the Guardians. Now, do I think that this was a good choice? Yes. To be honest, they weren't even all that relevant in the comics to begin with, and putting this kind of setup in the very beginning of the series is a massive win over the comics. The Guardians were introduced and killed in the same issue, so it wasn't even that much of a loss when it happened. It could have been under different circumstances, though. Kirkman said that he originally planned for Nolan to kill the Guardians in issue number 25, which would have given us time to introduce them and learn to love them over time. Oh, what could have been. But we can only live in the present. Now, the manner in which it happens is very different. Nolan seems to be in a fugue state when it's happening in the show, kind of leaving audiences to wonder if he was being mind-controlled or something. Especially as somebody who watched the show version before I read the comics, I much prefer the show version for this reason alone. I like the idea of Nolan sitting with what he did rather than how he was in the comics. He was rather pompous in his reply to the Immortal, and while it's chilling, I just think the dire straits of the show are better. I think this has a lot to do with the show attempting to highlight Nolan's humanity to a much greater degree, with what I think are mixed results in the show. Actually, this gives me a great opportunity to show you guys the themes folder. So we'll just throw this one into the themes folder and we'll come back to it as we need it. This decision about Nolan sitting with what he did after he killed the Guardians is definitely in service to that though. Comic viewers should be excited about that since it's not until way later in the comics that we see Nolan's time as Earth actually changed him for the better. Way later, like issue 102 later. I should also point out some behind the scenes context here. As I mentioned, Kirkman planned on Nolan being a hero for a while longer. Because of that, the entire comic wasn't really leading up to it, so I have to imagine that if Kirkman had any other chance to play with this story in any way, of course he'd make Nolan's intentions very upfront, which makes sense because he did. The setting of a White House attack is pretty strong too, since it establishes to all of our red, white, and blue-blooded viewers that these guys are the protectors of us. There's a little more iconic to an American than the White House, except maybe a McDonald's. But establishing such high stakes for these characters from literally the very beginning of them being introduced allows the showrunners to really raise the stakes of these characters. The setup of establishing how important the Guardians are only to have Nolan then take them out really does make it feel like the Earth is defenseless, which we can actually talk about as our second themes folder. Earth is defenseless is an angle that is played up much more in the show. It's a concept that exists in the comics as well, with Cecil doing similar shenanigans with the teen team in both mediums, but the show really hammers it in with scenes like Cecil refusing to clean the blood smear off the wall of Guardians HQ. This theme is actually the primary reason for a lot of the changes in the show, so we'll keep that in mind moving forward. As for other things that are different, Deborah is a significantly more developed character in this one episode alone. Now, that could be for a few different reasons, but the first one that comes to mind is the Hollywood's behind the scenes stuff. Sandra Oh is a great actress, and the show probably wanted a bigger screen presence for her. Or the writers knew that getting a high-profile actress to play a minor character wouldn't be feasible. This also comes into play later with Mark Hamill, but
We get there when we get there!
having Debbie as a foil to the new superpowered and exciting life of Omni-Man and Viltrumites and fly training, it helps ground Mark into a character that the audience doesn't forget, with what I think is more success than the comics. Don't get me wrong, the comics play with this idea a bit, but the show takes it and runs with it. Mark places a much greater importance on him becoming stronger and more powerful than he does in the comics, and this is actually because Nolan places a greater degree of importance on Mark being something powerful for him to wield. This concept is kind of completely absent from the comics besides the implication coming in hindsight from the training he had with him. Nolan also doesn't do any kind of tough love training, like when he punches Mark in this episode. That scene is specifically unique to the show, and again, I think it's part of Nolan trying to push Mark into being something he doesn't want to be. It's also probably why they added in the scene of Todd punching Mark a few times in school, to show that the pressure of being invincible is weighing really heavily on Mark. More on that in season 2 actually, so I guess hold your breath for that one. Now, the scene where Mark tells his dad that he got his powers is pretty neat, because Nolan can clearly see that everything has changed. So obviously it wasn't his motivation in the comics, since Invincible gets his powers in issue number 1, and the Guardians die in issue number 7. So I think this change was made to show a bit more humanity in Nolan. We can file that one into our themes folder as well. And I mentioned it briefly, but the interaction between Mark and his mother are probably to get Steven Yeun and Sandra Oh to have a conversation together. I feel like in Hollywood, having two great actors attached to a project and not share a screen together is probably a sin. But sins aside, the conversation does actually add another layer into the show that I think is really neat and the comics don't really play around with. These are regular ass people. It's not really a theme as much as just a background aspect of these characters. It really does feel like some random ass high schooler got these powers and all of a sudden they became a superhero. This first episode seems like it's really laying the foundation for a lot of familiar settings for comic viewers. The Muller twins, the Guardians, Mark's powers, Nolan's intention to push. None of these changes are crazy when you think about the kind of story that they wanted to tell for season 1. Nolan kills the Guardians and Mark has to stop him. That's the plot that we're building towards, and this episode wastes no time with it. And honestly, good for it. I think this is the biggest threat of the first 20 issues anyway. I mean, the Chicago fight has repercussions all the way up until literally the last issue, so it's obviously important. But I think it's important to recognize that due to the pressure Kirkman was experiencing as the first 15 issues were coming out, there's a lot of room to rework the story into something that feels more cohesive altogether. And now that we've laid the groundwork for what's to come, let's talk about episode 2.
Since the Guardians are apparently indisposed.
So from this point going forward, we kind of begin the Villain of the Week era of Invincible, but let me explain that quick. Usually, Villain of the Week episodes are like self-contained stories that push the plot forward in the background, but Invincible uses the Villain of the Week to push forward the main plot, not the other way around. I only mention it this way because the comics don't really do, well, any Villain of the Week issues, so it's a really sharp departure. Well, actually that's technically not true, but I'll talk about it another time. At the very least, they usually don't stay Villains of the Week. Anyway, the episode starts with the same security guard from the White House in London. He's with his son like he talked about, and a trash bag enters the ground and slams into them. It's the same one that Mark threw into orbit in the last episode. It's then match cut, kinda, with the Guardians HQ, which is in absolute tatters after Nolan's attack on them. We see some government suits step in.
Now who are all these people? Who cares?
Wait, actually, I care. They're kind of important. They're the Global Defense Agency. They use some real high-tech stuff on the Guardians to try to preserve the parts that they can. And we finally get a look at our favorite character, Cecil We then cut to Deb waking up without Nolan, something familiar to her. Men in black come to her door, and then we cut to the Pentagon. Pentagon, but more specifically the Global Defense Agency, where they're keeping Omni-Man as he recovers. Donald gives them the tour, and he tells them that they work with superheroes of all kinds.
Who knows, maybe someday we'll even work with...
I like this one like a 5 out of 10. Invincible has been on the scene for like a day, maybe longer. Time works weird in this show. But come on, this kind of feels a bit forced from Donald. I don't mean to be so negative, but I'm putting it in D tier. So finally we get up to Cecil chilling in Nolan's room. Cecil talks to the family a little bit, noting that they're keeping the news under wraps from the public right now. But with Omni-Man unconscious, the first Flaxen attack begins. Mark flies in to try to help, but undergoes a kind of shell shock upon realizing what fighting an alien force really looks like. He tries to help out an individual woman, but in doing so accidentally breaks her arm and leg. Adam, Eve, and the teen team join the fight, and we get a quick character introduction on Adam, Eve, Rexplode, Duplicate, and Robot. I'll be honest, the first time I saw the show, I thought that he had the power to see slightly into the future since the first words out of his mouth are
2.5 seconds after this sentence, 3 enemy tanks will align.
But no, he's just a robot. Coolio. Adam, Eve bails Invincible out, telling him to get the lady to the hospital. Mark listens, and Robot is nervous about the attack, but it doesn't go on for a very long time due to the rapid aging of the Flaxens. Back at the Pentagon, Mark tries to save the woman whose leg he broke before. Since he's here, Mark goes and sees his dad again. He's putting a lot of pressure on himself to be like his father, similar to the first episode. The next day at school, Mark confronts Eve, who he pegs as Adam Eve. Big shock. She then correctly identifies that he needs to talk about what he saw yesterday. Off to the roof. They have a calm, kind conversation about being new to superheroing, and she invites him to see the teen team headquarters. Cecil debriefs Robot in the city, where he scolds him for the battle claiming so many lives. Robot correctly identifies the aliens as the Flaxens, which he can tell because he mastered their language already. Sheesh, nerd. Cecil and Robot deduce that the Flaxens stopped their attack because they were dying of old age. Cecil moves on to the Guardians HQ, where Donald gives him nothing but bad news about who killed the Guardians.
I ask you for some good news, Donald.
It gets chilly in the room, so Cecil makes everybody leave to get a jacket, and Damian Darkblood appears to talk about solving the case. Cecil leaves him to it, and it's shown that Darkblood has the ability to do the Force Echo thing from Jedi Fallen Order, so that's pretty cool. Mark has a small interaction with Amber before flying away with Adam Eve, which seems like it kind of surprises Amber, who was totally digging the conversations. Mayhaps she's getting jealous of Eve? I mean, who wouldn't love a gal that can take him to Teen Team HQ? Mark still is a bit shoddy with his flying, which is a really neat detail given how bad he was in the last episode. We have a closer meet with Eve's boyfriend, Rexplode, Robot, and Duplicate.
Which one of you do I look at when we talk?
Robot gives the team the lowdown on the Flaxens, shows them the early warning device, and asks if he can count on Invincible in the future. Mark goes back to the Pentagon to talk over developments with his comatose dad.
I know you don't like teams much, but...
Little understated, don't you think, Mark? Mark visits his injured old lady friend, and I'm just thinking about the medical bill she's probably going to get being in a Pentagon super hospital. Good job, Invincible, sending her family about $4.8 trillion of medical debt. Rex comes out half naked and notices the early warning system for the Flaxens, and Mark tells William about his unexpected friendship with Eve. Eve pulls him away as Mark leaves William harder than my dad did when he said he was going to get cigarettes when I was 2. He'll be coming back any day now. Amber rolls up and asks William if he's dating her. William says no and springs into the best wingman mode possible.
Want his number? I'll write it down for you.
Invincible and Eve roll up, and Rex is super bitchy towards them, which is a running gag, so be prepared for that. The Flaxens return, and the strategy of waiting for them to get old and die doesn't quite work as effectively as expected, so they jump into battle, with Eve notably asking Invincible if he feels up to this. The Flaxens bring pretty impressive technology with them to hard counter everyone's abilities, except Eve, because she's absolutely the most overpowered character in the show. I'll get to it later. Although she does get her face trapped by the putty stuff from The Incredibles, and Mark gets trapped in some quick hardening cement stuff. Seeing his new superhero GF about to die, Invincible loses his temper and does a force repulse, saving Eve and nearly killing the Flaxen Emperor. In his scuffle, he discovers the wristbands preventing their aging, so they target those and the Flaxens are forced to retreat again. Mark gets a call and leaves harder than my dad did when he was going to buy cigarettes. Oh wait, I already did this joke. And heads to the Pentagon to see his now awake father. He seems delighted to see his son and extremely supportive of his new superhero adventures in his absence. The old lady Mark saves dies in their care, as well, and Omni-Man tries to tell Mark that that's okay, these things happen, but not before putting on his Karen wig and demanding his costume back. More training between Mark and Nolan, this time where Nolan tries to teach Mark how to throw a punch. Nolan is just about to throw a punch back at Mark, but is instead stopped by Debbie. Debbie pulls them down because Cecil has a job for Omni-Man, but instead Mark volunteers and Cecil goes for it. Nolan instructs Mark on how to breathe in space.
You don't.
And they send Mark to confront the alien. Alan pulls a racism, telling Mark he shouldn't have shaved his mustache, thinking all humans look alike, just awful. Their fight has a bunch of amusing dialogue, which Mark wants more of, so he just asks to talk instead. They have a timeout, and Alan specifies that he's an evaluation officer from the Coalition of Planets. Mark is quite confused, so Alan tries to clarify that Urath sent a request for evaluation, but this is of course Earth. Alan introduces himself, Invincible does the same, and Alan's suggestion about his name is the same as Eve's.
It's a little optimistic.
Yeah, I know.
Alan leaves and Mark heads back down to Earth.
Cool.
The show does a really good job not normalizing things too quickly since Mark is brand new to this, and so is the audience. Nolan re-explains to Cecil what happened to the Guardians, the totally real story of arriving at the Guardians HQ to answer a distress call, the lights going out, and passing out. Cecil doesn't believe him. Debbie asks if he has any other leads.
Someone thinks they're too clever for us. They all think that at first.
Which is a long way of saying no. The Flaxons open more portals to the planet yet again, but not before Mark has a very kind and sincere apology from Todd, along with Amber's number. Apparently some old photos resurfaced and Amber was using them as blackmail. Would have been more realistic if it was some old tweet. The teen team arrives on the scene, and Robot has some bad news about the Flaxons. Rex tells him he has a screw loose.
I don't use screws. My fastenings are all magnetic interlocks.
Mark tries to take on the Emperor head-on, but gets outclassed, and the rest of the teen team are disabled faster than before, with the Flaxon leader even drawing blood from Mark for the first time in the show. It's all looking really bad before Omni-Man gets there, tanks a bajillion of their bullets, demolishes all of their forces in less than 15 seconds, yes, I counted. Then the cherry on top flies into the portal to fight the Flaxons on their home turf. Invincible is obviously pretty stunned when his dad flies into a portal, and he lets everybody know by screaming "Dad" to everyone within earshot. Mark returns home to tell his mom, who isn't worried in the slightest. Now, me, on the other hand...
You don't seem to understand. Earth isn't yours to conquer.
I am very worried. He reduces the planet to rubble and is back before Mark even leaves the kitchen. Mark runs in for a hug, obviously very nervous about his dad, and Debbie is just kind of chilling about it. A news report comes on the TV about the Guardians being dead, the news finally breaking to the world. We roll a little bit of credits, thank you, Simon. Damien Darkblood appears to tell Cecil that Omni-Man is probably the killer, and Cecil doesn't want to hear it even a little bit, but still puts a surveillance team on Omni-Man. Little paranoid there, Cecil, don't you think?
That's the neat thing. You don't.
The title of this episode, Here Goes Nothing, comes from issue number 5, right before he goes into space for the first time. So starting at the beginning, all this stuff about cleaning up Guardians HQ is show exclusive. Well, starting at the actual beginning, the trash bag re-entering orbit and hitting down on London is actually a joke from issue number 20, when Mark's graduation cap hits people worshipping the garbage bag. I would also like to bring it to everyone's attention that the Burger Mart trash bag has its own wiki page, so that's fun. Back to the real stuff though. Deborah waking up to the reaction of the Guardian's death and Nolan's time in the hospital are show exclusives. Mark coming downstairs and both of them being taken to GDA for a tour by Donald is a show exclusive. And so there isn't actually a part before issue number 13 that Omni-Man is out of commission. However, the scene where Cecil Stedman is introduced is taken from issue number 13, the epilogue to Chicago. But the similarities kind of begin and end with I'm Cecil Stedman. Cecil informing Mark that the Guardians were killed is a show exclusive, as in the comics it's Nolan himself who informs Mark that the Guardians are dead in issue number 8, immediately following their death. The first news we hear of the Flaxon invasion is from Cecil and Donald talking about it, but in the comics the first attack is noticed by Omni-Man and Mark as they're just enjoying their time together in issue number 3. He is paged in the comics, so it might have been Cecil, I don't know. Now we move to the first instance of the Flaxon invasion, which plays out differently from the comics. The first invasion of these guys happens in issue number 3. They're kind of a one-off enemy, at least for now, and doesn't feature the teen team at all, even though they were introduced in issue number 2. Speaking of, their introduction in the comics was to team up with Invincible to fight the Muller twins, although it was just one of them at the time, which is absent from the show entirely. Probably because the attack on the White House replaced the introduction of the Muller twins. The introduction in the comics plays the teen team off as just another thing that exists, nothing super relevant, and as such they don't really have a proper introduction for every character. And the name Teen Team isn't in the comics at all. The fight with the Flaxons itself in the comics is set in a desert, not in a city, and the dead civilians, the
realistic aspects of superherodom,
is the show exclusive. The old lady that Mark tries to save is non-existent as well. Mark putting a lot of pressure on himself to be like his dad, as I mentioned briefly in episode 1, is also not a factor in the comics at all. So him crying at his dad's bedside is not something that happens literally or even in spirit. William being worried about his friend doesn't happen in the comics. William is a much smaller overall part of the comics. Whenever a lot of the early issues focus on Mark's social life, they put Eve in the spotlight, not William. The conversation with Eve in school exists in issue number 2, after he's already met Adam Eve on his late night patrol. It's significantly shorter and he doesn't name drop himself. Cecil and Robot talking about the Flaxon attack doesn't happen in the comics since Teen Team didn't fight the Flaxons in the comics. The closest approximation I can give is in issue number 9, when Cecil Stedman and Donald tell Robot he's leading the new Guardians. Robot and Cecil never have a conversation before this. Robot learning the Flaxon language is actually a nod to the comics as well, except in the comics it's much, much later, and it's Rudy who learns the language, not Robot, although it's not really that much of a difference. Which is to say that Robot shouldn't be able to understand the Flaxons yet. Cecil and Donald returning to the Guardians HQ is a show exclusive, as he never actually visits in the comics. That's because they were a private organization funded by Darkwing and War Woman. It's only after they die that the government is invited to take over. Alright, now let's talk about Damian Darkblood. He first comes into the picture immediately before the Guardian's funeral in issue number 8, and he talks to Omni-Man. Now, Nolan is in a coma at this point, so that would be impossible. Also, Darkblood does visit Guardians HQ in the comics, but he doesn't have the Force Echo ability shown in the show, and he visits for additional evidence he missed the first time, not pictured. He does this because he's out of leads, and the investigation is going nowhere. He's not a very good detective in the comics, I guess. So bad, in fact, that Cecil dragged in a separate pair of detectives to do the investigation because Darkblood is taking too damn long. I already mentioned that Amber is a small part of the comics, so her conversation with Mark doesn't happen anywhere. Even Mark flying around the city is a show exclusive, although them visiting Teen Team HQ for the first time does happen in issue number 2. And it's also how issue number 4 opens, where we get the reveal that Rex and Eve are dating. Other than Rexplode spoiling the element of surprise in their first fight against the Muller twin, he's not really a dick in the comics. I mean, he still cheats on Eve later and he's overconfident, but he's not like a pompous asshole that he is in the show. The early warning device for the Flaxons is a show exclusive, and the Flaxons don't actually return in the comics until issue number 71. We've got a long way to go, folks. And it's another surprise attack. Mark taking care of his father once again is a show exclusive, as is him talking to his parents about his new superhero friends. Although we do get one page of Mark talking to his mother about his new love interest in issue number 9. Rapid fire quick. Mark visiting the old lady doesn't happen, Rex noticing the early warning for the Flaxons doesn't happen, William telling Mark that he has no chance with Eve Wilkins, Amber's questioning about the two of them, and Rex's jealousy of Eve and Mark's relationship before the fight begins, all are show exclusives. And now, onto Flaxon Attack number 2, which doesn't happen until issue number 14. The issue immediately following the destruction of Chicago features our favorite time-defeated aliens. Which means in the comics, the second Flaxon Attack isn't stopped by Omni-Man, but the first one is. Omni-Man does indeed go to the Flaxon dimension, but it's under entirely different circumstances. For one, it's at the end of the first attack, and he doesn't necessarily go there willingly. He actually gets kidnapped at the end of issue number 3, and only returns in issue number 4. The destruction of the Flaxon planet isn't really seen in the same way as the show, except briefly in issue number 93, when the new Flaxon Emperor mentions the Destroyer to Robot and Monster Girl. Omni-Man also seemed to be doing it for retribution from being held prisoner, not just as an offensive attack. This is also the only time in the comics that Omni-Man is off-world before the Chicago incident, but it's not even addressed by the greater world, and the Guardians are still alive at the time, so it's not really that big of an issue. Anyway, back to the comics. When they attack the second time, they're actually seeking retribution for the destruction of their world from Omni-Man during their first attack. In the comic, the second interaction is much quicker, with the Flaxons outright telling our heroes that it's the wristbands. They strike in the desert instead of the city once again, and the Flaxons bring a massive fighting force, but nothing as impressive as their technology in the show. Mark having personal moments where he does lose his temper and save Eve is a show exclusive. Nothing this personal happens in the comics. Once their wristbands are destroyed, they quickly retreat. Nolan waking up from his coma is obviously a show exclusive, as is the old lady dying, and Nolan being sus and protective about his costume is a show exclusive because he doesn't take any damage whatsoever when fighting the Guardians in the comics. Sorry, murdering the Guardians in the comics. The news about the Guardians' disappearance isn't in the comics, since we go right from their death in issue number 7 immediately to their funeral in issue number 8. Mark's punch training with his father is a show exclusive, and they don't do any fight training in the first 13 issues, just flying and fun training like throwing a ball back and forth. Cecil telling Nolan about the incoming Alan the Alien fight is a show exclusive. In the comics, it occupies the entirety of issue number 5, but it's Nolan who calls Mark to ask him to bail him out because he's busy. Some of the dialogue matches up, like Cecil's 12 minutes, although I think it's funnier in the comics as Nolan drops that he can just hold his breath casually for 2 weeks. When Mark gets up there, the dialogue isn't nearly as accurate, and Alan refers to him as his successor, not quite confusing him with Nolan. I'll also say that a lot of the choreography in this scene is really spot on, and that actually goes for a lot of the fight scenes in the show. Cecil pressing Nolan about the Guardian's murder is also a show exclusive, as in the comics he wasn't even at his house, and again the investigation into Nolan wasn't really a comic thing. Todd giving Mark Amber's number is a show exclusive. In the comics he receives his number directly from Amber in issue number 8 before the Guardian's funeral. Now, the third Flaxon attack happens in issue number 71, as I briefly mentioned, but it's so incredibly different than the show's depiction that it's hardly even worth getting into. The similarities start and stop with the Teen Team is present, at least what's left of the Teen Team now that Adam Eve is out of commission, Duplicate has retired, and Rexplode died somewhere in the Invincible Wars. In the meantime, Nolan saying I need to shave is lifted directly from the comics. Mark calling out Dad and Rex making comment on it does have some roots in the comics. Rex isn't the one to bring it up though, it's Nolan when he mentions it to Mark when they're playing catch in issue number 6. Another big departure is that in the show, the general public doesn't know that the Guardians are dead. The show has this news headline where it's like, where are they? And it ends the episode with the reporting. But in the comics, everybody almost immediately knows because the funeral happens immediately after. Debbie's nonchalant attitude about Nolan being kidnapped is lifted from issue number 3, immediately after it happens. Different words, same sentiment. More pork chops for us. And again, the Dark Blood scenes with Cecil are show exclusive. The investigation lasts from Damian Darkblood's first appearance in issue number 8 until issue number 16 when he, well, you'll see.
They seem to have spent their time wisely.
So I think it's a really great idea for the show to focus so much on the Guardians being dead, especially since the comics kind of brushed it off. With Omni-Man now being the last line of defense for Earth and viewers knowing he's got his own agenda, the atmosphere is extremely uncomfortable, especially since we kind of pick up pretty quickly that Mark may be the only one who could stop him. This episode does more for the expansion of Deborah as well, since she's the only parental figure in Mark's life while Nolan's in a coma. It's a really layered addition to try to have her give her son some confidence that would normally come from the most powerful man on the planet. The show's introduction of the teen team is pretty cool. I like that even though most of the episode is devoted to them, they're still only a piece of what's going on. It really feels like an homage to the comics to set something up and not let it pay off till later. And even then, there was plenty of action to go around for them in the episode. The thing that I don't love, at least so far, is the Flaxons. Visually they're cool, and let's be honest, when Omni-Man says, "Earth isn't yours to conquer," we all wanted to kiss J.K. Simmons. Mwah. It's a really pointed, hey, yeah, in case you didn't get it, he's the bad guy. A little on the nose, but the delivery makes it worth it. It also gives some light to how badly Omni-Man messes them up when they're over there, since it wasn't really shown in the comics. So the reason I'm split is because the Flaxons were a drip feed that happened across almost the entire comic, and arguably the most important enemy for Earth, based on what happens to Robot and Monster Girl. There may be more time to develop them further in season 3, and honestly I'm counting on it based on the little teaser at the season's end, but having 3 Flaxon attacks in the same episode rather than spreading them out across the season feels really condensed to me. And that's why before I said that we're entering the villain of the week approach for the show. The Flaxons were in the story, they had their time, but if they don't come back, that's all they were. A problem for this episode. The comics do a very, very good job of not forgetting anyone, and letting loose ends tie themselves up in unique and satisfying ways. Most of the time. The show really brings all occurrences of an enemy into one episode and then lets them work the episode until it's time for the next guy. The Flaxons do serve as the first outer-worldly threat for Mark in the show, which helps him realize that besides fighting Titan, people can be in real danger. I think the scene of him trying to save the old woman, and even in doing so breaking her arm and leg, is a really great play into another theme. Yay, we get to talk about the next one. Mark is not invincible. File that one away. Wait, no, take it back out, I'm still talking about it. It may seem obvious if you've seen the show, but Mark not being literally invincible is a really big deal. He's a new kid on the block trying to figure out his powers, and for the time being, it seems like he's getting more used to being unhurtable. But what can hurt is his emotional state, which comes into play quite a few times in the show, but actually not very much in the comics. There are moments of him getting bothered by the grotesque nature of his line of work. I talk about this in episode 6, but the show does it much better. He's just a kid after all, and he's only got his powers for like, what, a week? And even for a Viltrumite, especially with the pressure of his father looming over him, Mark is considerably invincible. Speaking of Alan, wait, no, JK, there actually isn't much to talk about when it comes to him. If you saw the show appearance, you've basically seen his comic appearance. Although what I can talk about is the moments before Mark gets into space. Cecil is a bigger part of the show far quicker than he was in the comics. His active role doesn't actually start until issue number 13, and that's probably because he was, as he puts it, so high up the CIA doesn't even know he exists. So managing people like the Guardians and Omni-Man seems right up his alley. And so it's only when Mark becomes the strongest thing on the planet does Cecil get involved in his life more. All that aside, broadening Nolan's professional and personal life in the show means that Cecil can be brought in as an accent to that, which is fantastic. Cecil helps reinforce all 3 themes that we're going to talk about. He acts as a reminder that Omni-Man has friends and allies, and literally manages people designed to defend Earth.
I'm doing a damn fine job of it!
And he acts as a safety net for Mark in multiple instances, with the biggest example being in episode 5. We'll get there in time. Now, let's talk about Amber. Zazie Beetz is a really commanding voice, and she does a really great job playing Amber. Did you know she was actually also the hallucination woman in Joker? Which is fitting since she severely hampers Mark's mental state on a regular basis. Fit that one into Mark is not invincible. Okay, but seriously, she's very different than she was in the comics. Amber in the comics was, well, blonde for one. I'm gonna call her Blonde Amber, is that cool? Blonde Amber had a very specific role to play in Mark's life in learning how to balance regular life and superhero life, while he was still waiting to see if he even liked Eve. Blonde Amber's role was kind of to force Mark into making a decision about if he wanted to have his half-human life remain as a part of his daily life, or dive fully into being invincible. I think Show Amber's role is much more entwined with distractions for Mark, which I could maybe make a theme for, but it's kind of just something that happens. Mark tries to save a city, gets distracted by an old lady. Mark tries to help out a soup kitchen, gets his guts ripped open by Worf from Star Trek. Mark tries to stop his dad from destroying Chicago, gets distracted by one family in a building. It's just a thing that kind of happens to him. And so Amber helps reinforce this distraction element for him, in the process helping prove that he is not invincible. Boom! Brought it back around.
Despite your name, I believe you underestimate yourself, Invincible.
This episode opens with a collection of superheroes and normal people attending the Guardian's funeral, with Omni-Man giving the eulogy. The in-comparison cheery funeral during the day ends, and now we get the rainy funeral at night, where the close family and superheroes get to mourn over the actual dead bodies.
The public can't know where the actual bodies are buried. Souvenir hunters.
Foreshadowing is a narrative device.
Red Rush's partner, Olga, has a freakout, and Mark realizes that if the Guardians can be taken down,
It means that none of us are...
I give this one like an 8 out of 10. It's pretty somber for the moment, and it fits with one of the themes, so we can sock it away in our themes folder. Doesn't feel forced, especially given the conversation he had with his dad earlier in episode 1. I like this one. Let's do A tier. Darkblood confronts Nolan, and Cecil confronts Robot, telling him that he wants him to put together the new Guardians of the Globe.
There was an idea.
The Grayson family gets home, and there's an interesting interaction where Nolan encourages Mark to keep what happens out there separate from what happens at home, and Nolan seems to be apathetic about the Guardians' death in general. Gee, I wonder why. We then reveal that the GDA is definitely spying on the Graysons, and Mark gives Amber a call and they set up a study date. Eve returns to the Guardians HQ where she catches Duplicate and Rexplode literally mid-orgasm. It's a clever display of her powers in this show, all of her clones feeling the same thing that she does. It's an element that was never really gone into in the comics, so I'm glad to see it here. Personal note, Duplicate was lied to by Rex saying that Eve is dating Invincible, so I fully dub her as blameless. Eve is obviously emotionally distraught, so I forgive her for being mad at Kate, but when she cools down, she should definitely see that Kate did nothing wrong. We go back to the Pentagon where we see one of Kirkman's favorite jokes, US Pentagon parking in rear. Underneath, we have Robot and Invincible talking about the new Guardians tryouts, and then the superheroes fight each other, which to me seems kinda brutal to be honest. The new Guardian lineup finishes with Black Samson, Shrinking Ray, Duplicate, Monster Girl. Monster Girl punches the fuck out of Rex, and Invincible sticks up for him.
Invincible hit that little girl!
It's amusing. Rex is not quite as pleased to be saved by Invincible, though. Anyway, Rexplode and Adam Eve are the last members on the roster, cause that's a good idea. Adam Eve declines on account of Rex's infidelity, and Robot asks Rex what he did. To be fair, I would be fucking furious if literally the strongest member trying out for the Guardians didn't want to be a part of the team because some douchebag broke her heart. Adam Eve and Invincible go flying together where she fills him in, and then we go back to the Pentagon where Robot lays out some strict training for the new Guardians, and Rex is displeased. Although Rex has other problems.
I don't know you yet. So I'm gonna assume that was a joke and I don't need to beat your ass until all you wanna do is call me Dad again.
Whew, fuck me, Black Samson. It's gonna be so sad when you die. I'm kidding for the show, anyway. Monster Girl hangs back from everybody and talks to Robot about how training will be impossible on account of the curse that reverses her aging. She's actually 24 and she has a very honest conversation about
guys who are interested are either going through puberty or popping up on sex offender registries.
It's then revealed that Omni-Man is in the facility calling the new Guardians pathetic. William and Mark clean up Mark's room before his study date with Amber, but it's interrupted by Cecil, who tells Mark that he's got to go to Mount Rushmore right now to fight Doc Seismic with Adam Eve. He tries to destroy the monument, Mark saves some kids, Doc Seismic falls into lava, fight over. Fun fight, but not really lore relevant beyond what I've mentioned. Mark returns home and tries to run upstairs to Amber, but instead we get the most realistic depiction I've ever seen about a son who's trying to leave a conversation that his dad is trying to give him. And Mark gets back to his room where Amber has been waiting for him for over an hour. Meanwhile, Donald wraps up a kaiju where Cecil tells him that he'll have to save it for later. Rex does a large display to get Eve's attention and apologize, but she declines anyway, trying to see Mark instead, but he's already with Amber, so she flies away. There's a Dupla Paul reference in the show, which is a character in the comics, and then the Mauler twins escaping using Pete's lifeless arm, which was unlocked via Robot. The escape is entertaining and the reveal is surprising. The after-credits scene is Deborah being surprised by Damien Darkblood, searching for clues for his mystery, and Nolan seems to know what that means.
Undergrad in sociology and women's studies, I had a minor in African dance. Not enough politics!
And the title for this episode, Who You Callin' Ugly, comes from issue number 9, when Monster Girl says it to Mark. The quote is actually, Who are you calling ugly, but we can let it slide. So this episode starts out with the funeral for the Guardians, which is in issue number 8. Notably the issue immediately following the Guardians' death, unlike the show which had an entire episode between them. The funeral in the comics doesn't actually go over as smoothly as in the show, with Black Samson's butler crashing the funeral and trying to kill the already dead guys because they rejected Samson when his power started giving out. There's also the small acknowledgement of Damien Darkblood, who, as mentioned before, is not really as important as in the show. The Mauler twins also show up in the comics, specifically to show respect to their valiant enemies, a great sign of respect for them. And maybe just find out where they're buried, I don't know. The show also has this second secret funeral, specifically for the superheroes and the families of the deceased, which is entirely missing from the comics, with another conversation between Darkblood and Nolan. It caps off with a conversation between Cecil and Robot, which happens in issue number 9, not at the funeral, but at the Pentagon. Cecil makes it obvious in that conversation that he does not want to be managing the new Guardians, and instead passes that off to Donald. The conversation also does not have the same aura of, I hate that I have to do this, but I'm doing it anyway, that the show kinda does. Next is the debrief from the funeral, which is absent from the comics, as well as the GDA spying on Nolan bit. That is a show exclusive. The conversation between Amber and Mark, as far as I can tell, is another show exclusive. No shock there since Amber is an entirely different character from the comics, more on that later. Eve returning to Teen Team HQ, where she finds Rex banging it out with Duplicate, happens at the tail end of issue number 6. The comics don't have any blow up between Eve and Rex, instead saving that for an intimate moment between her and Mark. The new Guardians tryouts play out in a similar fashion as in the comics, except it being a little longer, happening in issue number 9. It should be noted that the bit where Nolan is watching over the new Guardians and calling them pathetic also doesn't happen in the comics. Nolan acting as a kind of overseer for all the things happening on Earth doesn't really happen in the comics at all. The preceding stuff with Amber also doesn't happen. The Doc seismic attack in the comics happens as a cold open, and it isn't given much credence at all, actually. It doesn't end as dramatically as him being dropped into lava, and most notably, Eve is absent from the fight. Mark does it as a solo mission. Doc seismic does fall into the Earth's crust, which allows him to later control the Legions of the Underneath in issue number 36. Cecil and Donald seeing the nearly dead kaiju beast that Omni-Man took down is a show exclusive. The kaiju only has one appearance in issue number 10, but it's a much different circumstance, and we'll talk about it later when we get up to it. The Muller twins breaking out of prison is a show exclusive, as they were never in prison to begin with in the comics, since they weren't stopped at the White House and they attended the funeral peacefully. Well, that's technically not true. They did get thrown in prison for issue number 17, and they are broken out by Angstrom Levy. So comic reference, but not parallel, I suppose. And of course, the final scene between Damian Darkblood and Deborah also does not happen in the comics.
We just came from your friend's funeral.
Co-workers.
The funeral is a really interesting scene to remix. It remains a much more somber tone for the show and a much more cartoonish, this is just the life of a superhero in the comics. The comics in general maintain a really lighthearted vibe to them, especially in the first 49 issues, which give the punchy moments like Chicago a real heavy weight to them. Also, Black Samson hasn't shown up yet, so his butler crashing the funeral would have been a choice. I also really love that for comic viewers, seeing the secret funeral probably was a welcomed sight, taking something old and making it new. So now, let's talk about Damian Darkblood. First off, giving more spotlight to Clancy Brown, Mr. Bob, is never a bad thing. And when you make him a detective, I think he really shines in that role. So the choice to make this random character an important part of the story in the show is kind of an obvious one. At least until the end of his arc, but don't worry, we'll get there. But come on, you can't say you weren't at least a little interested in seeing the US government working alongside a demon detective to figure out that a Viltrumite in disguise murdered Earth's mightiest heroes. It's a cool sentence. So real quick, let's pull Earth is Defenseless out of our themes folder. There's not another man alive more concerned about Earth's security than this man, and he handles it way tougher in the show than he does in the comics. The dude is always on edge, looking for an advantage, and he is not happy about the Guardians being out of commission, taking a lot of that out on Robot, eventually replacing him with Black Samson and then later the Immortal. It helps build up this theme, and in retrospect, Cecil not being worried about Earth's security in the comics is a really strange place for him to be in. Not that he wasn't at all, but he assumed much more of a fatherly role in the comics than in the show. This makes sense as he was filling this role for Mark after Chicago, feeling responsible for not stopping it. Which kinda gets lost in season 2, but I'll talk about that whenever. The changes to the new Guardians tryouts were probably just for pacing and making it more exciting. The fighting between the heroes was pretty cool to watch, not much for analysis needed on that one. What I can definitely talk about is the new Guardians' growing pains. The comics had them all kind of come together real quick like true professionals, while the show really gives it this ragtag group feel, which I would consider more realistic since they're all just random people trying to work together anyway. Their inability to instantly gel significantly attributes itself to the same theme, especially with Cecil hanging over them to get it right. Dr. Seismic. I think they changed this up because even Mark had to spend much more time together in the comics, and so to pin them up against an enemy is a good way to make up for lost time. It's an acceleration of Eve's story. I didn't actually get to mention it in the comics, but they have an entire arc about a teacher in their high school who's rigging up bad students to explode, and the two of them working together to stop him. So Doc Seismic is probably a surrogate for the bonding they did in that story. I think they really wanted to do this will they won't they with Mark and Eve way quicker than they did in the comics. They only start talking about their relationship in issue number 39. The show seems to do this thing where they want to shove a lot of character building into one episode, and that's typically not how it's done in the comics. The comics really took their time developing these people, allowing a random page in an issue that had nothing to do with them to be dedicated to a completely different character. A great example is in issue number 28. Mark and Nolan are fighting the Viltrumites, and there's 2 pages dedicated to Black Samson talking about his new/old powers with the Immortal. It really allows these characters to breathe and develop over time. But the show seems like, well, Eve is in this episode, so let's develop the fuck out of her. Even still, I think it's a good change to have Eve and Mark share more screen time, especially with their relationship on everybody's mind, especially comic viewers. Omni-Man being an omnipresent force, get it, during the new Guardians tryout is another neat change. It feels like once they acknowledged that they're going to lean more into the Omni-Man as an evil character part of the story, they really ran with it. Which is cool, because in the comics it does seem like it kind of comes out of nowhere. We know that he has his duty to Viltrum, but he isn't overtly evil in the comics whatsoever, which makes it all the more impressive that the show was able to find a good balance between Nolan wrestling with his humanity of being a good father and being an outright evil character. We can file that one into our themes folder too. The Muller twins' breakout is much more bombastic in the show than in the comics, and I think that's just thanks to the animated medium. It makes fight scenes more engaging. Do not at me on that one. I know there are some absolutely stunning fight scenes, but come on, you can't tell me that this is better than this. They can barely even be compared based on how different they are. Wait, why are they different again? Oh god, that's the name of the segment! So they're different because the context is different. But I think the answer is much simpler. It wanted to prime audiences for later when the Muller twins hear it was an act of mercy and respond with "we do it all the time," making their ability to clone themselves more of a get-out-of-jail-free card rather than a scientific process that they only do under the worst conditions. I mean, listen to how casually and callously he murders his brother here.
But I can always make another one.
The Muller twins only ever kill themselves one time in the entire comic run, and the circumstances are actually one that we do get to see in the show for season 2. It's the scarred Muller twin, you know what I'm talking about. So already 3 episodes in and it's starting to feel like 2 very different stories about the same characters. The comics keep lighthearted with Mark going on these micro-adventures, but the show takes these themes in an entirely different place, showing a bit more despair in the show, especially showcasing the frailty of humanity, and Mark being an extension of that humanity. Truthfully, I feel like this is an angle Kirkman didn't really get to explore in the comics because the first 13 issues went by so fast. And then suddenly Mark was a full-time superhero who got his ass kicked by his dad.
I'm gonna take a rock if that's okay. Yeah?
This episode begins with an Egyptian excavation of some ancient god or something. It doesn't much matter because Mark accidentally stops a huge problem by flying a little too close to the ground, something his father corrects. His father encourages him to exercise and gain better control of his powers, and then they chill on Mount Everest. And he specifically talks about how family is so important to him.
Okay. I'm in.
I think this one's pretty funny, doesn't necessarily fit any of our themes, but doesn't seem forced either. This one's like a solid B tier. Debbie talks to Olga about her skepticism about the death of the Guardians. Olga is moving back to Moscow and asks Debbie to sell her house for her. Later, Debbie does some research about the Darkblood sightings. When Nolan and Mark return, Nolan kinda gaslights Debbie about her friend. Cool. Mark and Amber go out on a date to...
Out.
Ooh, out.
They go through a culture festival and have some cute moments. Then Nolan confronts Damian Darkblood, where Darkblood accuses Nolan, and Nolan has a veiled threat for Darkblood too. He ends the encounter.
Go fuck yourself, Darkblood.
The Mauler only child takes over a warehouse where he can clone himself once more. He starts the process, and then we go to the new Guardians entering the old Guardians HQ for the first time. Cecil meets them, tells them to stop gawking, and then shows them a bloodstain he left on the wall as a good reminder that they're not invincible. Oh, crap, I should have done the title card there. That would have been good. Rex makes up with Monster Girl, and Robot tells Rex to knock off the flirty shit because of what happened with Adam Eve, and Robot steals his blood. Debbie does some work stuff at home when Nolan calls her
the wife of the most powerful man on Earth.
Cool. And it's interrupted by Cecil flashing into the living room and Nolan nearly kills him. Mark returns from his date with the promise of a second date and finds Cecil and Nolan arguing about a trip to Mars. Mark volunteers, and after going back and forth, Omni-Man agrees too. Mark tells Eve about the date and how he's going off-world for a bit, and Eve asks him if he's serious about her. Mark then goes to tell Amber goodbye, they do a cute coupley thing, and then Mark zooms off into the space shuttle, cutting it very, very close. Cecil debriefs him for the upcoming weeks, and they take off. Nolan and Debbie watch the space shuttle launch, and they have a little fight. Debbie calls him out for being distant and different ever since Mark got his powers, and Nolan speaks from his heart about what it's been like dating Debbie. It's very cute and a very human interaction. Debbie and Nolan go on a cute date for the 2 weeks that Mark is gone as Mark travels to the Red Planet. They land and the astronauts begin exploring, mining, crafting, wait, no, not that, but yeah. Mark falls asleep and loses track of the astronauts, and we go back to Rome where Nolan lets Debbie in on the idea that he's hiding something. Nolan ignores a giant dragon attack in order to get Debbie's approval that she trusts him. He's on vacation after all. While they're in Rome, Damian Darkblood investigates their home, snooping and spying, and Cecil, of all people, stops them. Back in space, Mark finds the hidden underground civilization of the Martians. Well, more specifically, he's attacked by Sesquids and then attacked by Martians, who notably speak English, or sorry,
we speak Martian.
Mark is taken to the Martian King, where he explains that the Sesquids are a parasitic species that endanger the humans, and it's also explained using these nifty comic panel kind of art style. It's cool. The Martian King explains that they are to be executed, and so Mark does the only reasonable thing in that situation, which is... The Martians chase them, Mark covers them, gets into a huge fight with the Martians, and escapes. But not before the Sesquids form a hive mind with one of the astronauts, and one of the Martians poses as that astronaut. Mark nearly walks in on his parents getting it on, which is amusingly covered up, and then he goes to tell Amber very vague details about his trip. Cecil and Darkblood get back to his office where he says he found dried Guardian's blood in Darkblood's office. Darkblood said it was planted, Cecil knows that, but still performs the exorcism to send Darkblood back to hell. He says he needs to keep things gray until he can figure out why Nolan killed the Guardians. Sure would be nice to have a detective to figure that answer out. Debbie ends up being a really good real estate agent, cleaning and selling Olga's house, and Robot brings a vial of Rex's blood to this ugly looking motherfucker right here. Debbie tells Nolan of her success, and it's hinted that Darkblood is still investigating despite being sent back to hell. This is a piece of evidence that will totally, absolutely, undoubtedly pay off in the future.
Welcome to our new digs, baby.
So in the comics, the Egyptian tomb thing doesn't happen as far as I can tell. This one's a show exclusive, which is a funny nod to the thought that Mark doesn't understand his own strength and literally stops conflicts without realizing it. Although the creators confirmed that Kahor will return for season 3, so we'll have to see about that. Oh, and I wanted to make the title card joke, so I skipped over this part, but the title, Neil Armstrong, Eat Your Heart Out, comes from issue number 18, when the astronauts step on Mars for the first time. This is my son, Corbin. Nolan encouraging Mark to exercise, as small of a detail as it may seem, is actually a big part of the comics, but it doesn't happen until much later. After Nolan leaves Earth, has Oliver, and tricks Mark into visiting him, all in issue number 25, only then does he tell Mark that he needs to exercise to get stronger. Debbie turning back to real estate also happens in the comics, but only much later, and not at Olga's request. There isn't really a comic equivalent Olga. She actually doesn't appear outside of the original picnic scene with Red Rush when doing the introduction for the Guardians of the Globe. The closest thing to Olga is in issue 15 when Debbie meets up with another wife of a superhero to try to talk about what living with him is like as she's feeling lonely, because that's after Nolan left the planet. Nolan confronting Damien Darkblood doesn't happen because now it's time to drop it. Darkblood only has like 5 panels in the entire comic run. Moving along, there's not really a sequence in the comics that reflects the Muller twins cloning themselves with the same details in the show. We know what happens, but we don't really get to see the process. Cecil showing the new Guardians around the Guardians HQ also doesn't happen. There's not really a passing of the torch feeling for the comics in that regard. There's also no bloodstain left on the wall. Robot never really confronts Rex over the Adam-Eve drama, and Rex doesn't really need to make up with Monster Girl either because their fight was short and Monster Girl says she got carried away. It's mostly overshadowed by Mark's disdain for Rex. Robot stealing Rex's blood does happen in the comics in issue number 25. Circumstances are kind of similar too. I'll talk about that more in episode 7 though, so keep an eye out for that. The conversation with Debbie and Nolan doesn't happen either. They don't have much to say to each other at all in the comics before the Chicago incident. Additionally, Cecil was hardly a player in the comics before Omni-Man goes off-world, so him having really any kind of conversation with Omni-Man is entirely a show exclusive. You may have noticed I skipped over a big chunk of the episode, and we're going to talk about that right now. Invincible's mission to Mars. Where you going? This episode is probably the least interesting as far as the comic content goes because Mark going to Mars happens entirely in issue number 18. It follows the beats 1-to-1 from show to comic. Although, to be fair, the Martians are much more explicit in kidnapping the humans in the comics. They just roll up and hypnotize them. Mark doesn't even fall asleep. Even the conversations are pretty square for each other. So good job, show, making my job easy. The scenes where Debbie and Nolan are enjoying themselves are show exclusives, except for the first argument they have where she says he's been meaner lately. In issue number 8, there's a scene where Debbie points out that he's being distant and he insists that he's fine. He tries to play it off as my friends were just murdered, but she pushes back against this. And that's kind of the extent of the overlap. It is notable that in the show she buys that the Guardian's death is throwing him off, but in the comic she doesn't. Mark returning home and seeing his parents very quickly readjust after sex is actually another fun nod to the comics happening in issue number 6. Mark telling Amber about his time back also doesn't happen. There's not really a heavy acknowledgement from the rest of the world when Mark returns from space. Although there is some homage to the comics Amber in issue number 19. Immediately after the Martian mission, Mark and Amber sit down to have a conversation about him always being late. And all of the content with Amber before the Mars mission is a show exclusive as well. There's no comic equivalent of the two having a cute date or anything. The only real date that we get to see the two go on is in issue number 17 when Mark and Amber exit the movies together, and it's a cold open of the issue. Cecil banishing Damien Darkblood doesn't happen in the comics at all. Matter of fact, Damien Darkblood, as far as we're aware, is still kind of just hanging out in the world somewhere in the comics. He gets laughed out of the GDA after Chicago in issue number 16, and he's never seen again. To clarify, he gets laughed out of the GDA because he has leads of who killed the Guardians, not actually who killed them. Except this only happens in issue number 16, which is after Nolan blows up Chicago, and his conversation with Mark is leaked to everybody in the entire world. So everyone figured it out before him. Good job, Darkblood. Robot bringing Rex's blood to his organic counterpart is a neat one that actually happens in issue number 21, which you may note again is after Chicago. A lot of shit happens after Chicago.
Go fuck yourself, Darkblood.
Okay, let's start with the big why is it different. Damien Darkblood. I've mentioned it before, but a lot of Hollywood is a convoluted effort to get two great actors in a room together. So I'm pretty sure the Damien Darkblood banishing scene is really because they wanted to have an awesome, grandiose scene between Walton Goggins and Clancy Brown. Not to mention the scenes between Hank from Detroit Become Human and Cave Johnson. Narratively, I'm pretty sure they had the entire Damien Darkblood storyline because it was cool to have a mystery that someone was trying to solve, giving the audience a surrogate to kind of root for and watch flail, while we know the answers. At least that's why I got excited for it. Or maybe he'll have some return in season 3, but I kinda doubt it. Or, to be more character-driven and less meta, the Damien Darkblood storyline is probably in service to making Cecil a more grey character. Darkblood was basically waving a flag in front of Nolan's face saying, "Hey, we're onto you," and Cecil didn't want to show his hand yet. Remember that deal with the devil panel I mentioned earlier? Well, that panel actually comes from Cecil's origin story in issue number 50. It shows Nolan's first time meeting Cecil, and when Nolan tells him the story about the World Betterment Committee, all the lie detectors say that he's lying. And Cecil does nothing because he'd rather use Omni-Man to do good while he's got him. The origin story is probably the reasoning behind Cecil keeping the world a bit grey in the show. It's kind of a shame though, because I really liked that element of exploring the world's greatest mystery of who killed the Guardians. I would have loved to see this more in the comics, but as we've said, there isn't a lot of time between the Guardians' death and Chicago. On top of that, we do have a lot of interpersonal conversations that are completely absent from the comics. I think the show's decision to make Amber a more key character is a solid one, as I mentioned earlier about him having to choose between his human half and his invincible half. A lot of it may have something to do with that whole Hollywood convolution thing I mentioned, but I think it really is genuinely just about expanding Mark's connections with the people he's close to. There are a few big departures that I want to talk about specifically. Firstly, the villain of the week format that the show adapts during the middle part of the season. This episode specifically, at least. The show has a kind of procedural feel to it when it does some interpersonal stuff in the beginning, the story of the week in the middle, and more interpersonal stuff at the end. The Flaxans, the Martians, and soon the Reanimen all kind of fit this mold. The Martians themselves are actually a bad example of this, because that part adapted to screen does all happen in one issue, but the Flaxans and Reanimen are so much slower to get rolling as they're developed over multiple different issues. This is an element that I accept in a begrudging way. Like, I know there's only so many episodes of TV you can have, especially just one season, so you're gonna have to really pick and choose which storylines to develop over multiple episodes and which ones to, well, not develop over multiple episodes. And I guess thanks to Shapesmith's appearance, it does go to develop over multiple episodes and even seasons, and since the comics were like this, it almost doesn't even matter, but I digress. This format kind of plagues the show from the beginning, and to be honest, it kind of affects all shows in some kind of way, so it's almost impossible to get around. Other than that, the Rex-Rudy storyline is something I want to talk about, because compared to the comics, it's happening way too early. The blood isn't even revealed as stolen until issue 26. All you need to know is that Rudy shouldn't be around until... Let's see, what else was happening in issue number 26? Mark meets Omni-Man in space again, so yeah, that was kind of happening. So why speed this up? Well, it's cool for one, especially since Rudy, as I explained, is probably the most pivotal character in Invincible. Also in a world, real life I mean, where it's really uncertain if you'll receive extra seasons of a show, why not set up some of your coolest storylines early to let them have a little bit more time to develop? When you've got like a 600-year-long part of Rudy's journey that still exists, it's good to get him on the field early. Going back to some other non-Martian related events, we can add Nolan and Debbie going to Rome under Nolan's humanity, especially when he says that he needed to hear that she trusted him. It also adds the extra layer of care to Debbie when she gives her line of,
I feel like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff, and I'm the only one of us who can't fly.
Which sounds like flowery dialogue, but it's based in her reality, which I think is really fun. The show is trying really hard to make us believe that Nolan is conflicted about his choices, and to be honest, I believe him.
There is no honor in killing insects.
The episode starts out with two gang members heading outside for a smoke break. They're run up on by Titan, the stone dude that Invincible fought in episode 1. Titan cleans house, throwing guns at people, just generally being awesome, and this one guy tries to stab him, and it plays the sound effect, the one from the Gmod videos in the early 2010s. Side note, it took me way too long to figure out where this actually comes from, but as far as I can tell, it's true crime New York City, in case anybody was wondering. Nobody was wondering. Some guy accidentally shoots himself, it's a good time. Killcannon tries to stand up to Invincible again, but it doesn't work out great. Mark is late for his date with Amber, same old, same old. He apologizes for being late, that's the main thing. Next we have Titan scorching some old apartment buildings. One guy who lives in them gives him shit, and Titan sends him across town with some money. Rocks have hearts too. Invincible saves a poor family from being crushed to death, which is definitely altruistic, but we should note that it was him who punched the hole through the building in the first place, so... And then Mark gets his hours cut at work because he's always late, and he responds to this by quitting. I mean, that's what I would do in the situation. Who hasn't been there? Titan shakes down some fool for money, but upon taking his wallet and realizing he has a family, he takes pity on him. Really laying it on thick there, Titan. Well, he is dense as a rock. Then we have a contrast scene of Mark and Omni-Man actually dropping a guy to his death to get information.
Okay, but you're gonna catch him, right?
Yeah, in a second.
Just kidding, that doesn't happen. Although, we're not 100% positive because now we go back to the most exciting setting of the show, school. Mark is late, again, and the principal tries to talk to him about his attendance if he's going to attend college. Titan breaks into a lab to steal a microchip, and this incredible interaction happens.
Your lives worth minimum wage, or do you want to fire your guns in the air, say you tried your best, and we all walk away happy and alive?
And if I can divest from the recap a little bit, this is exactly the kind of environment that I would expect from a world like this, and it's a shame it doesn't pop up more. But when it does pop up like that, the idea that these are normal-ass people standing in the way of a super-powered being, it's golden. Mark now texts Amber and says that he's gonna be late while fighting someone. It might just be some punk throwing shit at him, I can't tell. Then Titan brings the microchip to Wheatley from Portal 2, who puts it in his own head and says that he can't let Titan walk away because he's too useful. Side note, it's not actually Wheatley from Portal 2, I just think he kinda sounds like it, although he more so sounds like Rick, the Adventure Corps.
I'm gonna grind you up and use you to pave my driveway.
Get dirty with this robot!
This robot owes you money!
He also gives Vox vibes from Has Been Hotel. If you haven't seen it, you should. He tells Titan he knows where his family lives, so he can't let him leave. Titan hits a desk, and now we're in space. Mark saves the world.
Or at least the country.
From an asteroid, and then he has to run to have dinner with Amber's parents. I sure hope nothing goes wrong to distract him from this important night. Also, I'm going to talk about it later, so I want to bring it up now. Omni-Man has this extremely human interaction where he gives Mark leeway on seeing his girlfriend instead of training. This one time, he says. It's very sweet, almost makes you forget he's literally... Amber and Mark fight about if she's important to him, and he pushes back, saying yes. But she isn't feeling it. Mark walks home and accidentally kicks a rock into space. Do you want asteroids, Mark? Because that's how we get asteroids. Omni-Man calls Mark to pull him for more practice. Titan goes home to see his family and talk to his daughter about superheroes.
What's his name?
He calls himself.
This feels really natural, actually. I like this one a lot, especially since knowing his name will be important for Titan later. A tier for this one, too. And now Debbie finds Darkblood's notebook in her closet somehow and goes through it. It gives her the idea to see if she can find Nolan's costume. Eve then has a fight with her super misogynistic father. He wants Eve to forgive Rex for cheating on her because he believes that Rex was keeping her safe. I would like to point out that Eve's powers eclipse Rex's abilities by an exponential amount of like 40. Rex to the 40th power is Eve's power on a bad day. No one's arguing against this, but I feel like I really needed to make it known, especially in regards to the comics. We'll get there. Eve explains her powers a bit more clearly, saying she can rearrange atoms at a molecular level and then makes a door on the side of their house and leaves.
Don't you leave that door there!
Invincible goes flying and notices a message written on a rooftop by Titan asking for help. He tells him about Machine Head, his boss, and Titan appeals to the friendly neighborhood aspect of Invincible, which I really like. The idea that Invincible can climb down from his ivory tower to help take down this crime boss is very inspiring. Titan gives Invincible the lowdown on how a criminal enterprise is run.
I'm in a waste management business.
He owns the garbage companies, he owns the rental buildings, and he doesn't care who he hurts to make a profit. I bring it up because it's actually pretty solidly put together, not just a nebulous he's a crime boss so he makes money, like the Joker or Two-Face from DC, or even Kingpin from Marvel. It's a super quick explanation, but it's very rooted in reality and very easy to understand. Invincible sees Titan's family and now is very on board to help him take down the crime boss. He tells his family about what he wants to do over dinner, and Omni-Man thinks that this is beneath him. Debbie points out very truthfully that helping people is never beneath you, and it's at this point that I realize Debbie is a really, really great character. The new Guardians now come back from saving people from the Lizard League. Rex is celebratory, but Black Samson is having none of it. He runs through the fight explaining that they're not fighting like a team, you know, being a leader and all. Sorry, robot. And Rex and everybody else are having none of it. Rex is the fun, toxic cloud that seems to put everybody in a bad mood. He's actually more intolerable here than he is in the comics. Now we get back to the Grayson household, where Nolan specifies that Mark doesn't save lives, he saves millions. The two of them reconcile, and there's another moment from Nolan of
listening to me.
But then it's us when Debbie becomes displeased. Mark and Eve exit school, Eve is pissed because of her parents, and Amber runs up and demands that Mark is present at a function tonight, and then invites Eve as Mark scampers away. Titan and Mark sit atop a building, going over what the strategy is going to be to take down Machine Head, and let me say, we love a good plan. Then we take a quick break to catch up with the Mauler only child, as his clone is now complete. He infuses his consciousness into the other clone, and they're confronted by Robot. He's not here to fight, and he needs their help to clone a version of Rex from the blood he stole a few episodes ago. Now we've got Debbie outside her own house, calculating how long it would take to fly to Rome and back, so she has time to go into her house without Nolan being there. She's looking hard for his costume and finds it at the very last minute. Now we've got Invincible and Titan coming in to fight Machine Head, but he's not alone. He's hired some heavy hitters as backup. Small interlude to show Eve arriving at the soup kitchen to help Amber ahead of Mark. Machine Head's heavy hitters are actually no joke, and they seem to fuck up Titan and Invincible. Invincible gets flung through the ceiling, and it's shown that Omni-Man is omnipresent in Mark's failings, watching the whole engagement. Mark loses his temper again and punches the Magma Guy in half, but is taken down by Worf from Star Trek. And let me be clear, Battle Beast is no fucking joke. If the new Guardians hadn't showed up when they did, he'd probably have laid waste to him. Oh, and it turns out the Magma Guy is fine. Also, to reiterate, Battle Beast directly takes down Robot, Black Samson, Shrinking Ray, Rexplode, and Invincible. So when I say this guy is no joke, sheesh, he should fight Omni-Man sometime. That's a joke, but also foreshadowing, but not for the show. I'll get to it, I promise. He tries to kill Mark, Black Samson tries to save him but fails, and Battle Beast rips a hole in Invincible's chest. Black Samson does everything he can. Honestly, love the guy for trying, feels like a...
I could do this all day.
But gets utterly destroyed, and then Monster Girl tries to beat Battle Beast as well, and he claps her head in with 2 rocks. He also says pathetic child, which I think is fascinating because it means that he studied his prey, because he didn't know the Guardians were the ones he'd be fighting, which means he probably saw her as a worthy foe for him at one point. So now that Black Samson, Invincible, and Monster Girl are down for the count, Rexplode, Robot, Duplicate, and Shrinking Ray are going to clean up the mess. See, that's a joke because these 4 lightweights don't stand a fucking chance. But to be fair, Rex and Kate take down the Furnace Dude, Robot deals with Living Lightning over here, and Shrinking Ray puts a dent in Magma magma guy. Also, I find it funny that because of Duplicate's power, she doesn't even try to dodge attacks. She'll just let her clones die. Shrinking Ray actually does take down the Tongue Dude, which just leaves Battle Beast, who, again, to reiterate, literally took out the heavy hitters of the Guardians. But instead he leaves because this battle is beneath him, so fight's over. Rex punches Machine Head, and Titan leaves Invincible.
I'm gonna do my own thing.
Amber is disappointed by Mark's absence, but you know, he's busy losing a lot of blood. Mark sees his dad in the distance for only a moment as he fades into unconsciousness. Debbie gets the call, Eve gets the call, Cecil carts Invincible away. Isotope returns to the scene of the crime, revealing Titan was using Invincible, if only slightly, to take Machine Head's place. This is exactly what Nolan said would happen.
I think Mark is putting his trust in someone he shouldn't.
Also, the post-credit scene is Donald and some other scientists running experiments on Invincible's extracted blood. Also, the scientist is voiced by Reginald VelJohnson, one of my favorite voice actors ever. He's also the name of the high school.
Or do you want to fire your guns in the air, say you tried your best, and we all walk away happy?
And starting us off, the episode title, That Kind of Hurt, comes from issue number 19, when Mark gets hit for the first time by Tether Tyrant. Tether Tyrant is the Tongue Dude's name. The scene of Titan destroying the gang operation doesn't happen at all, like not even a little. The closest we get is Titan trying to rob an already destroyed jewelry store in issue number 16, and Invincible is like, hey, why not be a good guy and help us right now? And basically he goes, yeah, okay. Mark wiping the floor with Kill Cannon doesn't happen, and while he does have small little one-off fights with other villains, Invincible only fights Kill Cannon one time in issue number 58. Mark quits Burger Mart in issue number 3 very shortly after unlocking his powers. Titan shaking down guys for money and torching apartment buildings doesn't happen in the comics. I've mentioned before that Mark and his dad training doesn't happen till much later in the comics, so there's no comparable scene of the two dangling a dude 1,000 feet in the air. Mark being talked to about his school attendance is actually a scene from the comics, although it's not high school where his attendance is a problem. It's much later in issue number 37, as he's attending college. It's basically the same conversation, with even the same character, actually. And do I really have to mention every time Titan doesn't do something cool in the comics? It's getting kind of upsetting how much cooler he is in the show. Which actually leads to my next point, Titan doesn't have a family in the comics. He's just a free agent and does what he does. But he doesn't have a daughter or wife like he does in the show. A good addition if you ask me. Just look how lonely he looks in this comic panel. Debbie finding Darkblood's notebook in her closet doesn't happen because, as I mentioned, the investigation basically doesn't exist in the comics, and Debbie wasn't even really a character until after Chicago anyway. Eve fighting with her parents does happen in the comics, but not as a huge blow-up, and not nearly yet. Eve isn't really a character until much later, although her decision to leave superheroing is one that happens in the very next issue, issue number 20, but it happens privately to Mark, not to her family. Black Samson giving Rex shit for the Lizard League fight is nowhere to be seen in the comics, probably because the only fight with the Lizard League and the Guardians doesn't actually have Black Samson in it. It happens in issue number 40, and it's almost the same setup as the Sesquids attack in season number 2, so I guess I'll talk about it then. Titan signaling to Invincible that he needs help does happen in the comics, and it is a catalyst for the big fight that happens. Although it's very different, so let me lay out how it happens in the comics. Titan destroys a building to call Invincible. They meet up and immediately bust into Machine Head's office to fight him. There's no planning, no strategizing, no explanation. Machine Head calls for his backup, Mark underestimates them, and they wipe the floor with our boys. But to be clear, not even as close to as badly as they do in the show. For a quick comparison, he's still conscious when the Guardians show up. The show has a Guardians team lineup of Shrinking Ray, Robot, Rexplode, Monster Girl, Black Samson, and Duplicate. The comic has all of those, but also Bulletproof and Immortal. You would think that's probably what tips the scale in this fight, but Bulletproof probably wishes he would have sat this one out. The fight starts with the new Guardians making quick work of the goons hired by Machine Head, but the fight kind of takes its eye off of Battle Beast, who fucks up Bulletproof and Black Samson. And then he leaves. Immortal finds Machine Head under a desk, and Mark is up and moving around in the same issue. Unlike the TV version, which, well, you saw how that went.
Are you a good guy?
Starting at the beginning, obviously the show is trying to build up Titan to be more than he was in the comics. I wouldn't say he was terribly underdeveloped, but it's nothing compared to him in the show. Him having a daughter and outside motivation just makes him a better character overall, so I like the change tremendously. Also, somebody tell the writers that the line,
"Your lives worth minimum wage,"
did not need to go that hard. God damn, Titan. The extra scenes of Mark training with his dad are to help strengthen the finale, and I'll say it works. Having characters spend time together is never really a bad way to build them up. I will say that what's interesting to me about this scene specifically is that it looks like Nolan is training him on how to deal with humanity itself on a small scale, as opposed to things like getting stronger. I imagine if he was trying to prep him on how to take over Earth, he would give him lessons more about leadership, but I'm definitely nitpicking, especially because of the other scene about him stopping the asteroid is exactly the kind of shit I'm talking about. I'm gonna pull out the themes folder real quick to make sure everyone's still paying attention, and make sure that we file in Nolan's interaction with his son about seeing his girlfriend into Nolan's humanity. Making Nolan somebody more afflicted by humanity is really important for the show to get right, since they hinge on it being believable for the finale. This scene definitely plays into it, and I would consider it a unique one compared to some of the other similar ones in the comics. Nolan does have his more human moments in the comics. It's gonna be a bitch to talk about in the finale because it's very inconsistent, but having them stand out for the show is really good, and with an actor like the Yellow M&M, it's a believable performance. Yes, it's really him, you can look it up.
To exist
I've already talked about Damien Darkblood's role in the comics in regards to the mystery of who killed the Guardians, which is to say I've talked about the lack of his role in the comics. I think it's a really great move to include this mystery, you've heard it before, yada yada. But here, I can at least say that Darkblood's storyline is basically important to everybody else except him. The Darkblood investigation was never about finding answers to the mystery, it was more about amplifying the other characters. And if Darkblood can force Cecil to take more of a grey role and help Debbie develop some mistrust about her husband, at least I can say it had some role in the story. Next up, Eve's parents. Adam Eve is a character whose role was very tied to Mark in issues 1 to 13, mostly serving as an introduction to heroing outside of Nolan's influence. Shit, that kinda reminds me, wouldn't it have been cool if, like, the teen team were helping co-teach Mark about how to defend humanity while Nolan's lessons were actually, like, shadow teaching him how to control humanity? I don't know, I'm not a writer, but that sounds kinda cool to me. Anyway, Eve wasn't really given much space to develop as a character on her own. Her parents didn't even make an appearance until issue number 51. But since the show really likes to develop characters fast, it makes sense to throw them in a bit earlier and allow the audience to sympathize with Eve over them, especially when you hear how gross her dad is. You should hear some of the shit he says in the comics, yikes. Moving on, Amber's additional interpersonal conflicts with our protagonist, what a mouthful, someone call Lin-Manuel Miranda, with the protagonist, seem to be trying to add some drama with the show on a romantic level. I think this is fine in theory, but I really kinda wish they would stick to some of the themes they already had going, especially since the external conflicts are so large compared to Mark didn't show up at the soup kitchen. Although that is kind of addressed in season 2, so I guess we're slow rolling it. Pick a lane, Buster. I like that they made Amber more of her own character for the show, but I don't love how much time was given to her. It just feels like the show wants to tell this Peter Parker, I'm just a guy trying to make my way in the universe kind of story, but the other half of that is so absurdly powerful and interesting to me that it kind of just feels like the least interesting part of the show. And I'm a softie, so it's not that I hate romance or anything. Now, the finale of the episode. I was hoping to save this tidbit for the Chicago fight, but I guess I'll have to drop it here. Mark doesn't actually bleed until he fights his father. Up until that point, he really was invincible, and it was this really big, oh shit, this is gonna be bad kind of moment for the comics. The show, of course, changes this, showing not only can he be hurt, but he can be nearly dead from people who aren't even Viltrumites. I mean, shit, I'm pretty sure even the Flaxons made this guy bleed. Firstly, let's file this again under Mark isn't invincible. Now, do I think this was a good decision? I mean, maybe? I don't know. I like the idea of Chicago not only being this huge city-destroying event, but also being the first time Mark realizes he's vulnerable, and moving that to this episode robs it of that moment, but instead places the emphasis on Nolan instead, with Mr. watching over him from above. It feels much more like a test for Nolan to see if his son is even ready. The saving grace for removing this element from Chicago is that it places the weight on other things, like the millions dead as an external factor, and Mark's helplessness as an internal one. We're almost there, folks, hang in there. Or skip ahead, do whatever the hell you want. I will say that I really like that this random villain of the week story was turned into something that helps support so much of the themes. The comics kind of use it as a catalyst for turning Black Samson's powers back up and setting up Titan as a recurring mob boss, and I feel like the comics could have done more with the Titan character, so I guess I'm overall happy with how they handled him in the show.
We had sex by the water! It was the best thing that ever happened to me!
We open with a young Rick Sanchez surprising some college girls in the middle of the night, being gross and being abducted. He wakes up on a specimen table to some creep who cuts out his vocal cords. Probably for the best. I've seen enough episodes of Rick and Morty to know how it ends when we just let Justin Roiland talk for too long.
You're going to be beautiful. You're going to be in...
Do you think D.A. Sinclair knows that that name is taken? I feel like this was a smidge forced, but it could do worse. It can sit in C tier. So now we get back to GDA headquarters to see everybody who's nearly dead get nearly saved. I particularly like this interaction between Robot and the medical staff when he asks for something very specific and they don't have it and he just says,
"Then get it."
Relatable as fuck, Robot. You know, when we've needed a saline solution of 2%, belladonna root, and a 5% wolfsbane, at least Black Samson seems to be doing better. And Mark has an extensive surgery for which he's out for 6 days. Eve covers for him with his family at his bedside, but even being out for so long, he's the first to wake up. Cecil and Nolan have a conversation about Darkblood, ending with them talking about how Mark is disobedient to even the most powerful man on the planet. Mark meets up with Amber and apologizes for getting hit by a bus, as he says, and then they try to reconcile. Also, Mark doesn't do the phone gesture thingy, he just holds the phone like he's holding a brick, and I get why, but it still makes me sad. Mark sees William in school, who tells him about his trip to upstate U. Mark asks if he and Amber can come. He reluctantly agrees, and now we have our weekend trip all set. While Mark packs, Eve comes over to tell him that she's not going to college, and she feels that she can do much more good by just actually helping people. Which, I'm not even joking when I say, was exactly my idea the first time I saw this show. I felt so vindicated when I saw this as somebody who creatively understands her powers. The powers to control atoms at a molecular level is literally the most overpowered thing in existence. I'm so glad she's bringing it up. They drive off and William goes on about Rick. He's gay, if you haven't noticed. Debbie says she's gonna go to the dry cleaners and Nolan gets suspicious, so he checks his suit. It's still there, but he opens the bag to confirm it's actually his his suit, and it's not, it's a towel. I really appreciate this level of skepticism from both characters here. There's a quick interlude scene of the gang actually arriving at college, and then we're back to Eve. She packs her bag and replaces the front door with a wall so she doesn't have to hear her dad. Eve plans to irrigate some desert or do something useful with her powers, and her father tells her that she can't save the world. And I swear, if this was literally any other superhero, I would agree with him, but this is Adam Eve. No one realizes how scientifically powerful her powers are, and that's fucking insane. I don't have a crush on Eve, I have a crush on Eve's powers. Anyway, she leaves and we're back at college now. We see some posters about missing students around campus, and then we sit on Eve's dad giving us a lecture in biology. It's not really her dad, but the same voice actor. The professor talks about expanding the quality of life rather than life itself, and D.A. Sinclair speaks up, disagreeing with the professor, relating humans to machines. He's also voiced by Ezra Miller, and the only reason I didn't make a joke about it initially is because D.A. Sinclair is a really important name that we'll need to remember for later. Anyway, Ezra confirms he's an incel by calling Rick an alpha male and leaves. Now Eve goes on her fun nature vacation where she creates a treehouse home for herself. William and Rick go on a booty call, and Amber and Mark go look around campus for things to do. They go on a cute date where Mark confirms he wants to be with Amber.
You know, when you start a sentence with I think, you automatically murder 90% of any romance.
Yeah, well, I think you should shut the fuck up, okay? He's being cute. Doesn't matter though, they get attacked from underground by a robot cyborg. Their official name is Reanimen, like reanimated men, but I'm probably just gonna call them robot cyborgs because it's accurate and funnier to me. And there's no good way to say Reaniman. Reanimen rolls off the tongue, but if they're just one, they're just a robot cyborg. So robot cyborg nearly kills William, Mark saves him, William finds out his secret, and then Mark and the robot cyborg get into a big fight where Mark's on the ropes a few times here. Mark rips off his mask or faceplate thing, and upon seeing himself, impales himself on a spike. I mean, come on fellas, we've all been there before, right? Mark tells William he can't tell anybody, Rick thanks William for saving his life, and Amber blows up at Mark for abandoning her. D.A. Sinclair picks up the faceplate, revealing that the super evil looking guy is actually the super evil looking guy of the episode. Shocker. Quick cutaway for Eve watching the news on her phone about all the natural disastery kind of things happening around the world. Then Robot comes back and literally dies of cringe. Just kidding, he went on a suicide mission to help find a flower to help Monster Girl. God, I love this show. A different robot explains what it is and then has a conversation with Black Samson about how much he cares about Monster Girl. Now we have Debbie bringing Nolan's suit to Art. Art explains to her that all the damage on Nolan's suit was caused by the Guardians. There's also the thoroughness of oxidizing the blood, and the oldest is on the hands, proving that he struck first. Debbie tells Art not to tell anyone, and Art rightfully says,
I'm too scared to tell anyone.
And Nolan is flying right outside of the shop, watching them. Chills. Amber is pissed at Mark, so she goes to take a shower. Rick goes to buy beer, and William geeks out about Mark being invincible. Quick montage of Eve making the world a better place. Now we go back to Robot inspecting the Muller twins' work.
You know how hard it is to grow cells this quickly?
Yes, that's why I hired you.
When he doesn't have to pretend to be 100% a robot, he's so sassy it's adorable. Robot hasn't paid them yet, and they're not super happy about it, so they go and grab a shovel to get some insurance. William is hurt about not being told sooner and asks to go flying. Mark obliges, very quickly flying them in and out of the room, and then William asks to try on his suit. Amber gets invited to a frat party, but one of the good ones, according to him, and she seems to appreciate the invite. Rick and William video chat on his way home with the beer, but the feed cuts out and he asks Mark to go find him. But Mark is going after Amber to the frat party instead. Black Samson is back on his feet and feeling better than ever, and Robot stays with Monster Girl until she wakes up, revealing that he never left her side while she was in recovery. Then we have what is probably one of the most tense moments in the show, Nolan confronting Art about what he's learned. At first it looks troublesome, but Nolan just brought beers. Just want to have a good time with the boys, right guys? Right? But before we can see Omni-Man ripping out Art's lungs, we cut back to Amber about to enter the frat party alone. Elsewhere, William does some investigating and finds Rick's shoe next to an open manhole. Subtle. Cutting back and forth, Amber gets approached by the guy who invited her, and William follows the trail. Now Mark arrives at the party to find Amber, and we cut back to the part everyone actually cares about, and I'm not even kidding when I say that. Art and Nolan just riffing together with some beers. Cute scene. Nolan acknowledges that he should never piss off his tailor, as Art warns him about. It's a sweet moment if you forget the idea that Nolan is essentially holding a gun to his head just by existing. Mark proceeds inside, where we see Kyle talking to Amber before getting a panic call from William and having to leave, where they notably play the same William scream 3 times in 1 minute. Not important, you probably didn't even notice, but I did. Invincible is now searching for William, starting his search in the big hole the robot cyborg blew in the campus by the fountain area. He gets jumped by 3 Reanimen, and they pack quite a punch. D.A. Sinclair says that he's improved on them from last time, and that he's improving on humanity's flaws, like pedophilia, am I right guys? Mark knocks off another helmet and notices that one of the robot cyborgs are Rick, and William tries to appeal to his emotions, but it's obviously no use.
I removed them myself.
So Mark gets his shit kicked in, like really kicked in, and William ends up appealing to Rick's emotions anyway, as always happens in these situations. Rick rips out his own brain thing, saves Mark, and fights the other Reanimen as Mark rescues William. William then goes ballistic on D.A. Sinclair like he was grooming his 14-year-old daughter. Whoa, too soon? And then Mark bitch slaps him so hard his jaw nearly falls off. Cecil comes in, patches up Will and Mark, and carts off D.A. Sinclair. They then go to Rick's dorm, where Will cries into Mark's shoulder. Mark doesn't reconcile with Amber, Eve goes to her treehouse home after a long and rewarding day, and Debbie is is probably about to get her spine ripped out by Nolan. So Nolan enters the house knowing that Debbie knows he killed the Guardians, and she asks him why. Nolan keeps his cool but punches a hole in the wall anyway. Could have been much worse considering. And roll credits. But now after, we have a young Rick Sanchez, probably not C-137 though, digging up the Immortal to drink from his skull to get his powers. Can't blame them, I'd probably do the same thing. Although the Mauler twins show up to teach the audience about media literacy.
Don't believe everything you read on the internet, kids.
And before we get started, the episode title, You Look Kinda Dead, comes from issue number 20, with the full line being, of course, you look kinda dead right now. The intro scene of Doug hitting on the girls and getting kidnapped is the show exclusive. The closest thing we get is in issue number 31, when Rick abducts another homeless man in the middle of an issue that has nothing to do with D.A. Sinclair at all. Now, you already may have noticed that issue number 31 is very far away from the Chicago fight, which is in issue number 12. That's because the D.A. Sinclair / Reaniman arc of Invincible really takes a long time to get going. So, real quick for your convenience, here's a timeline. The first Reaniman appears in issue number 6. Then we don't hear from them again until issue number 20. Rick gets kidnapped in issue number 22. Then they take another break and don't have an appearance until issue number 31. And William gets kidnapped in issue number 36, leading to D.A. Sinclair's bitch slap and subsequent hiring from Cecil in issue number 37. It's actually the farthest out in the comics that season 1 goes, technically speaking. Now, to be clear, this episode actually follows the progression pretty neatly, since issue 6 and 31 only occupy a few pages, not the entire issue. It's kinda like the show uploaded an Invincible all Reaniman scenes in order compilation on YouTube, so you get to see what spans 31 issues in a neat 50-minute video. Anyway, the scene with Monster Girl in the hospital doesn't happen because she doesn't get her head caved in by Battle Beast in the Titan takeover fight. There's no comic panels about the hospital recovery stuff at all, actually, which includes Mark's recovery since he was still awake and talking at the end of that fight. Omni-Man talking to Cecil about Dark Blood doesn't happen either, since Dark Blood is the biggest letdown since Phase 4 of the MCU. Come on, you know I'm right. For real though, Dark Blood is basically a non-character in the comics, so once again, it's a show exclusive. In the comics, there's no mention of Mark's wounds to Amber anywhere in her story. The conversation they have, though, where Amber has a hint of jealousy towards Eve, is in the comics. In issue number 31, when Mark asks her to go to Africa with him, specifically because Eve lives there. The next scene with Mark and William talking about his excuses isn't in the comics, since William finds out about Mark's powers in issue number 6, which is fitting for the episode since that's the first Reaniman part. It's also worth noting that William is introduced in issue number 1, and then doesn't return until issue number 6, so there isn't really a whole lot of excuses to be thrown around in the comics. In the comics, William is not going to upstate you for Rick specifically. He actually hates Rick in the comics when they first meet because Rick calls him Bill instead of William. The scene where Mark is packing doesn't happen in the comics, although the scene where Eve tells him that she's stopping her superhero journey does happen. In issue number 20, which is again fitting since it's one of the Reaniman issues. She tells Mark she's done, ranting a bit about what her powers actually are and how they're wasted fighting bad guys. In the comics, however, she does the whole, Mark, like she's gonna tell him she has feelings for him. In the show, she just leaves. The long drive where William fawns over Rick doesn't happen in the comics. The scene where Debbie is kinda cold to Nolan and leaves the house also doesn't happen. As I mentioned several times, the investigation / Debbie distrust thing isn't in the comics at all, including the bloody clothes and Nolan finding out that Debbie has swiped them. The kids pulling up to college doesn't happen in the comics, and again, here's the first introduction to Rick. Not exactly smooth sailing for these two crazy kids. The scene where Eve leaves her parents for Africa isn't in the comics either, she just leaves, not telling them where she's going. The closest comparison I can find is in issue number 51, when she returns from Africa and asks them if she can move back in. Her father isn't talking to her, and there isn't any real kind of discussion about his feelings in regards to her powers. The introduction to the campus is excluded from the comics. They don't really have a guide like Rick, so they kinda just, I guess I'll go this way. Doug Cheston is a show exclusive, so his missing poster is also excluded. The lecture in the classroom about biology isn't in the comics, it's just thematic for the episode. Instead, we have Rick telling Mark that he's taking a freshman class for the second time. Cute. This lecture in the comics is in issue number 20, which is the second Reaniman scene, and it's when Mark and William are attending college as freshmen instead of visiting as high schoolers. Amber standing up to Sinclair also doesn't happen in the comics. The only interaction that exists in the comics is between Sinclair and the professor. Not even when he starts monologuing.
He starts monologuing!
Does he compliment Rick in the same way he does in the show. The next scene of Eve making her house in Africa is a show exclusive. When Mark and Amber arrive in issue number 31, it's kind of a surprise to them that she's got it. The scene of William hitting on Rick doesn't happen, and I guess this is a good place to throw in that the evolution for Rick and William is that Rick insults him, they grow into friends, after they put Rick back together they become roommates, then they're dating just in time for Mark to visit them in issue number 80. So not really a love story happening for these two in the comics. The montage of Amber and Mark exploring the campus doesn't happen, although there is a conversation between the two of them in issue number 20, but Mark is already attending college at that point and Amber is going to a different school. The next scene of the first Reaniman attacking is neat, because it actually combines two scenes from the comics. So firstly, he busts through the ground. That entrance is specifically from issue number 20. The gurgling kind of talking he does is also from issue number 20, as in issue number 6 he didn't speak at all. Amber in the comics doesn't worry about other people getting hurt, and she's not even on campus for the first Reaniman attack in issue number 6. The choreography of the scene is all in all a show exclusive. There's no truck to throw over, the creature targeting Rick doesn't happen, William being a hero doesn't happen. The fight scene in issue number 6 basically goes like, Mark can't stop the rampaging cyborg zombie until the end of the fight, and issue number 20 has him flying high above the campus to defuse the situation. So the anime showdown in the show is exclusive to there. Here's actually a rather large difference. Mark never pulls off the Reaniman's helmet. Seeing his reflection is a show exclusive, and him killing himself over it is a show exclusive as well. In the comics, they actually were always after death. They emerged on campus but didn't really have an objective in mind besides killing themselves, and as in the show, that is how the Reaniman in issue number 6 dies. In issue number 20, he plunges his hands into Mark's eyes and Mark drops him from a height. William telling Mark about him being invincible is a comic adaptation. Amber breaking up with Mark over ditching them during the combat is from issue number 20, although much shorter. D.A. Sinclair being revealed as the guy behind the Reaniman happens at the end of issue number 20, as he moves labs due to one of them escaping. The quick scene of Eve deciding to make the world you want to live in is a show exclusive. And as mentioned, Monster Girl in the hospital is completely for the show. The scene where Robot talks to Black Samson is kinda sorta maybe I'm reaching taken from the comics. In the comics, it's Bulletproof who he talks to. Robot talks to him about Black Samson being in a coma, and their conversation is specifically about how shitty Immortal is as a leader, all taking place in issue number 21. The scene of Art investigating Nolan's suit is nowhere to be found in the comics. Nolan being a creep about it is also nowhere in the comics. He's much less omnipresent in the comics. See what I did there? The scene of Mark, William, and Amber returning to Rick's dorm is also absent. The scene of Eve repairing things across the world is actually lifted from the comics. In issue number 22, she makes this forest very lush. Not quite a montage, but at least they're paying homage. There's also another scene when Mark goes to see Eve in issue number 48, where she's distributing food to the hungry African people. The scene of Robot working with the Muller twins is taken from the comics, but it is slightly adapted. I actually will talk about this later as we get up to Rudy taking his first steps, so hang on for now, I'll get there. The conversation when William talks to Mark about being a superhero does actually happen very briefly in issue number 8, when they're at school. It's also the same issue that Mark takes William flying, although the circumstances are vastly more chill, so Mark isn't really doing it begrudgingly. William asking him if he can try on his suit is actually a reference to him actually trying on the suit in issue number 47. Rick's abduction is very different in the comics. For one, William doesn't view it in real time, and he doesn't immediately tell Mark. That'll wait until issue number 24 when he casually drops that he hasn't seen Rick since issue number 22. And then he officially mentions that he's missing in issue number 25. It takes quite a bit for this ball to get rolling. When it does roll though, William assuming that it was the Reaniman who abducted him is directly from the comics where he believes the same thing. Mark's insecurity about making things worse is entirely a show exclusive. The only reason he didn't help before now was because William had to make it very obvious that their friend was missing before he stepped in. Mark chasing after Amber is a show exclusive as well. Robot and Black Samson having a conversation about Monster Girl is show exclusive, although it is a reference to the comics as after the fight with Battle Beast in issue number 19, Samson falls into a coma and when he awakes in issue number 27, he has his powers back. So when he says,
"Almost like before I lost my powers,"
it's probably a reference to that, and a foreshadowing event for the show. The scene with Nolan having a conversation with Art over a beer is a show exclusive. There isn't a lot of time to have the two of them commiserate since the investigation basically didn't happen in the comics. Amber's house party shenanigans are a show exclusive, as are William's investigation of Rick's abduction. William comes up with a better plan for finding Rick. He himself is going to get abducted as a homeless person and have Invincible follow him so they can find out where Rick may have gone. The plan goes smoothly in the comics as William gets abducted by the Reaniman. William getting locked into place is almost the same choreography, but the dialogue is different, and Mark looking for William is obviously not the same because in the comics he was following him the whole time. Mark getting ambushed and dragged under the water is what happens in the comics though. D.A. Sinclair's note about fixing humanity's weaknesses are a show exclusive. He's much less psychopathic in the comics, also less talkative. Invincible ripping off Rick's helmet and William noticing it is a bit different in the comics. Mark is actually the first to notice and he rips it off in the pipeline, not in the lair. The show is a bit more dramatic about having Rick come around to being human again. There's no appeal to the previous sex at the beach house or anything like that. But once Rick comes around, it's pretty solid for the comics. They didn't treat this scene as a huge emotional one, so it progresses as you'd expect. Oh, and the ripping the back of your head off thing doesn't happen in the comics either. I'm not sure what specifically that piece is supposed to be, but it doesn't exist in the comics at all. When D.A. Sinclair runs away and William stops him, that doesn't happen in the comics either, as D.A. Sinclair temporarily paralyzes William and leaves him on the table. Mark's bitch slap is lifted directly from the comics though, with him also telling Sinclair to shut up. But where it differs is that Cecil is the one to step in to tell Invincible to stop. Mark apologizing about his temper to Cecil is lifted from the comics. So a bit of additional context, this issue is actually after the Angstrom Levy incident, so it's very possible that Cecil thought Mark would have killed him if he didn't stop him. After this whole event, Mark consoling William in Rick's dorm afterwards is a show exclusive. In the comics, it's actually a very different tone because William was also taken to the Pentagon to get treatment after being paralyzed, so he's feeling rather healthy. The sadness of this issue actually comes from when Cecil shows Mark how they're putting Rick back together. It's kinda gruesome, and the emotional weight is on Mark for letting Sinclair's work ruin lives and losing his temper about it. Moving right along, Eve being satisfied about her work is a show exclusive. And finally, Debbie being confronted by Nolan is a show exclusive as well. There's no scene whatsoever about them talking about it, even after they got back together about 100 issues later. The post-credits scene about the Muller twins getting the body of the Immortal is from the comics, but they have an entirely different reason for digging up his body. You know, being no reason at all. They weren't doing it as an insurance policy, that's for sure. This episode perfectly illustrates what I was talking about with the show kind of speedrunning long-running events. This episode spanned a villain that appeared in issue 6 and was only taken down in issue number 37. Now, let's be clear, this happened because we wanted the Reaniman in episode 7, and that's a good thing. I know, I've been a broken record about how the show needs to slow down and let things simmer, but this was a fucking excellent speedrun of an arc. As I think about it more, I almost wonder if telling the Titan story and the Reaniman story kind of in tandem wouldn't have been better. Scatter some scenes of both those stories in episode 4, have them both kind of coexist for episode 5, and then wrap them up in episode 6. I don't know, I'm not an editor. Actually, yeah, I am, hire me. I think the resolution of the Reaniman arc is kind of cheesy. Appealing to a brainwashed friend's emotions always feels a bit too much like the power of friendship, but I can't blame the show any more than I can blame the comics. Actually, haha JK, yes I can, because in the show they specifically clarify that D.A. Sinclair removed Rick's emotions, while in the comics they just forego any kind of specifics. The power of friendship, what bullshit is that? I think Mark slapping the jaw off D.A. Sinclair was done better in the comics just because of the timing. It happening after he killed Angstrom Levy means that there was a real possibility that he would have killed this dude. It was much more overt that Cecil wanted to work with DA in the comics than in the show, since he talks to him in his jail cell at the end of that issue, which is missing from the show. And like I said, I think this is a great way to throw this character and have him be a part of the story before Chicago, which is an absolute win. Can I also throw right here that I think it was a risky move having Ezra Miller play DA Sinclair? He was somebody already clouded in controversy in 2020, and having him voice such an important character in the show means that he may not be invited to, or be able to, return for future seasons. For context, DA Sinclair was in the second to last issue of the comic, so he's along for the ride. The Eve stuff is nice to have sprinkled in, and it's kind of exactly what I was talking about a second ago about peppering the audience with little bits of the bigger story throughout the episodes. I wish they did that more in the show. I will say another example of them doing it right is all the stuff with the robot and the Muller twins. Having this storyline be a small bit of each episode really goes a long way for me. At the very least, for showing that the world is moving outside of Mark. I mean, it's 2 minutes in this episode, but things continue without our protagonist, and that's good. I'd actually say it's like really vital for good world building. Debbie continuing her investigation into the Guardians murders with the inclusion of her going to Art is really nice. It's cool to see her inch closer to the truth bit by bit with knowledge that the audience already has. We know what's coming, but for her to realize it is fun. Now behind the scenes, again, how can you have J.K. Simmons and Mark Hamill in a show and not have them have a conversation? Yeah, I get it. But I'll be honest, they're right. You can't have J. Jonah Jameson talk to Firelord Ozai and not have it bring some kind of smile to your face. But actually, I think that their dynamic was one of the most underdeveloped parts of the comics for me. When Omni-Man flattens Chicago, Art takes a real hit thinking that his friend betrayed him, and he commiserates with Debbie, finally giving her some character and something to do in the comics. Especially since we knew for sure that Omni-Man killed the Guardians, it really does feel like Art's life is hanging by a thread in this scene, and that's really good. The sense of tension is really solid. Mwah. And now the very last scene. Having the Muller twins use their uneasy deal with Robot as justification for digging up the Immortal makes much more sense than just digging him up for no reason. Hey, wait a minute. They're working with Robot to get a control collar to control the Immortal, but they're digging up the Immortal to get insurance from Robot. But how are they going to control Immortal without the control collar that they're going to get from Robot? But they need protection from Robot. Yeah, it's a plot hole. Whoops. Earlier in episode 2, I mentioned that Cecil acted as a different thing for each aspect of the themes, and now I can make mention that he is Mark's safety net. It's possible that Mark could have recovered on his own, but having Mark be nearly dead and need Cecil's people to operate on him shows not only is he not invincible, he's dependent on the people around him, which is a fun way to broaden the theme from something surface level to something interpersonal.
You should have stayed dead.
Alright y'all, I might be talking a little crazy here, but this episode is like the best episode of the entire show, seasons 1 and 2. Fuck the last episode. This episode right here is just peak. It starts with Debbie waking up without Nolan, going downstairs and seeing the hole in the wall. She finds Nolan standing there with his destroyed suit, and it looks like we're gonna get a conversation, but not before we see Mark driving back home with William and Amber. She's mad at him, then we cut away to Eve making herself coffee in the morning. French press, of course, and she's got a cute little teen team mug. Adorable. But now Nolan explains to Debbie what's really going on. She runs through the obvious, the being blackmailed or controlled kind of things, and Nolan very honestly says he wasn't. Nolan says he wanted to tell her months ago, but he didn't, and now she doesn't trust him. Nolan leaves dramatically and angrily through the ceiling. Debbie tries to call Mark but gets his voicemail, and Donald instead safely transfers her to the GDA facility. Amber gets dropped off at her house, slightly tells off Mark, and walks away from him. So he flies in her window and reveals that he's invincible. She then reveals that she knew weeks ago. She is upset that he lied to her, she says to leave, and so he does. So now Monster Girl returns to Guardians HQ. Rex throws up some fireworks and fills milk cartons with her missing poster on them with beer. Black Samson also confirms that his powers have indeed returned. Robot has a sweet moment with Monster Girl.
I would never let you die.
Well, it was sweet. Robot arrives at the Mauler twins' facility with his real organic self. They argue about payment, and they implant a neural link into a 12-year-old clone of Rex Blode. We now cut to William and Mark talking about Rick over some burgers. He rightfully chews out Mark for not helping Rick sooner, and Mark takes a page from Eve's book and quits being a superhero. William tells him to cheer the fuck up since shit ain't so bad. He's right, by the way. And Mark goes to talk to somebody else, somebody who would probably understand better. Debbie is now inside the underground base of the GDA, where she lets Cecil know that Nolan killed the Guardians.
I know.
Ha! Yeah, Cecil talks about killing Nolan, or at least stopping him, and he implies it would be done by Mark. Cecil asks where he is.
Where's...
This one feels serious, especially for what's to come. It doesn't feel forced, it's delivered coldly by our favorite government sociopath. I'm kinda tempted to put this one in S tier, but it can sit in A for now. Nolan practices telling his son that he killed the Guardians on top of Mount Everest, but he can't really bring himself to finish the speech, so he flies off. He notably shows a lot of humanity in the speech, including saying, "I didn't want to do it." The Mauler twins continue the procedure to transfer Organic Robot's mind into Kid Rex's new body. Kid Rex is eventually called Rudy, so I'm gonna call him that from now on. Now I'm a guy who likes philosophy, so I could go on for hours about the philosophical principle about if your physical body is destroyed but your mind is made into a perfect copy, would it still be you? It's all about identity. But I don't have time for that, and the show moves on pretty quickly from it anyway. It treats this philosophical principle like exact cloning, and I am A-okay with that. This process of brain transferring is actually really fascinating and well done, with the Mauler twins compensating for some misunderstood brain chemistry. Apparently his motor cortex is the size of a pea, so that's kind of interesting. The procedure finishes and Rudy puts Organic Robot out of his misery with a really touching display. Rudy even offers to put him back in the pod, but this was the plan after all. Original Organic Robot passes on, and he hands over the payment to the Mauler twins, something similar to a shock collar. But that shifty robot, he gives them payment but also demands they return to prison. Using the neural link, he powers up some Uber robots and attacks them. And now, Nolan returns home, trying to find Mark. They need to talk, after all. While he's looking around, he hears what equates to the scuff of someone's shoe, and crushes the head of an invisible GDA agent. He dispatches the entire unit with barely any effort at all, and the last agent attempts to reach across the street to the house, and Nolan notices this. He finds out that Nolan has been spying on them, although Donald tells them it was for their protection, and dude is right. Like, actually, let's remember, this started because we thought somebody attacked Nolan. Omni-Man should be thanking him. Anyway, Donald the fucking Chad holds off Omni-Man himself while the other agents get away, Nolan crushes his spine, and Donald blows up the house in an attempt to stop Omni-Man. Cecil doesn't seem very fazed and thinks this blast will stun Omni-Man for an hour or two.
Or maybe not even hurt him at all.
If I haven't mentioned yet, Omni-Man is fucking cracked in the show, guys. So now Nolan knows that Cecil is standing in his way, so he's gotta deal with that. Cecil and Debbie have to find Mark before Nolan does. Eve finds Mark before both of them, though, since he sought her out to talk. Robot continues chasing the Mauler twins with his Uber mech, and they build a gun by tossing it between each other and adding parts to it. It's actually really cool and highlights the uniqueness of the writing in this show. The Mauler twins strategize together, and I would really love to see an extended version of this fight, but it ends anyway when the Guardians are called back to HQ for an apocalypse-level priority. We now cut to William driving home when Nolan crashes down in front of his car. He casually and very calmly walks over to the car and... So William tells Nolan where to start looking, as I'm sure literally any of us would do. And to be fair, aside from the general shock, he has no reason to think that this superhero would do anything to hurt anybody. So Nolan takes off to head towards Invincible and Eve. Cecil comes over the Guardians HQ and tells the Guardians to sit tight, not explaining what's happening. Rudy shows up at the Guardians HQ to announce that he exists, and everybody is obviously confused, and Rex demands answers. The GDA finds where Adam, Eve, and Invincible are, and track Omni-Man closing in on them. Mark and Eve have a heart-to-heart about Amber, and then Eve talks about her parents and Rex. Nolan, en route to Mark, gets blasted by a fucking laser from outer space, and he immediately flies into space to deal with that. He flies through the beam and immediately beats the shit out of the satellite for giving him
the world's most expensive nosebleed.
Rex and the Guardians grill Rudy about why he made the decisions he made.
You didn't even ask first.
That's what you think is wrong with this?
We stand Black Samson's commitment to consent. It's kind of relatable though, between lying, stealing, freeing criminals.
Oh sure, who wouldn't?
This becomes inconsequential though, as Black Samson discovers that Omni-Man has now gone AWOL. Mark and Eve argue about whether or not they should call Cecil and figure out whatever's happening in space, and Eve leaves because she doesn't want to sit anything out, which makes Mark feel like he has to join her. Cecil shoots Nolan with a gun designed to get his attention and teleports just out of reach of Omni-Man at the last second. It's amazing the teleporter can get him so fast when his balls are literally the size of Texas. Cecil just wants to know why, and they talk about the events Nolan has put in motion. The conversation's actually pretty baller, with Cecil trying to invoke Debbie in order to get Nolan to slip.
I'm a good liar. I'm a very good liar. But you're better. You fooled her. Hell, you fooled all of us for what, 20 years?
Mwah. Cecil admits he's just buying some time. Nolan rushes him and actually grabs off a part of his tie this time. But then he's shelled from orbit by 3 Reanimen, slightly newer versions made by the newest DC Flash, who Cecil feels dirty even talking to in the war room. I would say that Omni-Man makes quick work of them, but he actually struggles quite a bit here, even if the fight isn't that long. The Mauler twins finish reattaching the Immortal's head to his body once more and get him ready to collar. Between Rudy and now the Immortal, these two have had a
productive damn day.
Nolan then faces Cecil's next weapon, the kaiju. Nolan calls Cecil desperate and they begin doing battle. Cecil tells the Guardians to sit tight as they're the last line of defense against Omni-Man.
Did he just say against Omni-Man?
Yeah, things aren't looking good all over. Cecil wants to teleport to Mark's location, but he can't because the kaiju blew out the teleporter. It doesn't look like it matters though, as Omni-Man is actually having a lot of trouble against Mary here. But at the last second, Mark comes in and saves Omni-Man, knocking a tooth loose from the beast. I remember seeing this for the first time being really tense actually. But even if Mark knew about Omni-Man, I think he would have pulled a Luke Skywalker and tried to save his dad anyway. Eve gets a call from Debbie, who puts Cecil on, trying to get her to come back to Guardians HQ. The kaiju gets Mark in his grasp, and Cecil admits to Debbie that he can't call off the beast. If it kills them both, it also takes care of Omni-Man. The Muller twins end up getting the Immortal back to where he should be, and begin what's basically CPR on his heart, where he flashes through a lot of his life. Notably, there's a frame of Abraham Lincoln, which funnily enough I will talk about later. The CPR works, and Immortal comes back to life, furious about Omni-Man killing him, and he flies away. Mark and Omni-Man are really getting it handed to them by this kaiju, and to make things better, Immortal approaches Omni-Man and starts laying into him. I don't think it's actually hurting him, but he at least is getting those punches in. Like, if you ever try to fight a 2-year-old. Notably, the camera sees the two of them fighting. Things end up looking really bad when the kaiju has Mark in his grasp, and the Immortal is preventing Omni-Man from saving him. It's another one of those really tense back and forths of how's this going to play out, since there are so many characters at play and it seems like none of them are safe. Speaking of, Immortal gets a hand shoved through his chest, and even after that, he tries to gouge out Nolan's eyes. Fucking Chad over here. So Omni-Man slices him in half, and not only does the media, cameras, and the entire world see, but Mark does too. Nolan flies up to Mark and calmly says as he practiced,
"We need to talk."
The title of this episode, We Need to Talk, comes from the last panel of issue number 10, when Omni-Man kills Immortal and tries to talk to his son about it. Debbie waking up in an empty bed, coming downstairs to see Nolan is all new material, as well as Mark driving home with his friends and Eve getting ready for her day. Same with the conversation Nolan has with Debbie. Donald showing up with these stealth soldiers are all show exclusives. The soldiers aren't even present in the comics at all. Mark telling Amber that he's invincible does happen in the comics, but it's under completely different circumstances. In issue number 22, after Amber spends the entire issue asking her friends if Mark is a drug dealer. It's kind of amusing at least. There's also no time in the comics that these two break up before Chicago. They do eventually break up, but it's adapted into parts of season 2, so I'll talk about it then. Monster Girl returning to Guardians HQ is a show exclusive because she didn't get hurt in the Titan fight in the comics. I wish there was some comparison with Bulletproof or Black Samson getting a homecoming since they were the ones to get injured, but there isn't. And now we get to the scene with the Muller twins and Robot, so it's finally time to talk about what the timeline looks like. As I've mentioned, the Chicago fight happens in issue number 12 and wraps up in issue number 13. But did you know that the Muller twins helping Robot actually happened after they already helped Angstrom Levy? Angstrom breaks them out of prison in issue number 17, and they continue to work with him in issues number 20, 22, and 24. That aside, we only learn that Robot is organic in issue number 21, and he steals Rex's blood in issue number 25. He presents the blood to himself in issue number 26, and he finally contacts the Muller twins in issue number 30. Here's an interesting departure. In the show, the twins handle the entire process, but in the comics, when we get the first look at the Rex clone in issue number 31, their services are only required for the brain transfer, as Robot has no problem actually creating the clone. They continue working on the brain transfer until issue number 32, and Rudy takes his first steps in issue number 34, way after Chicago. Rudy and Monster Girl have an extremely long journey ahead of them, but that's the part that's shown in season 1. There's a lot of moments scattered throughout the show that don't line up with the comics exactly, but that's okay. Like Rudy waking up for the first time shares some lines of dialogue with the comic, but it's more about the feeling of continuance, which the Muller twins have more to comment about in the show. The death scene of the organic robot is much more of a happy, sentimental note in the show. The comics make it more mechanical with like, this was always the plan, yep, let's do it kind of feel. The Muller twins do say it's touching in the comics, but nothing close to them wiping their eyes. In the show, Robot offers them a specific schematic which they can use to control the Immortal. In the comics, he instead offers them money, as his organic self has amassed a fortune, unable to spend it. In the show, he gives it to them and then tries to attack them. In the comic, he just straight up refuses. The huge robot that fights the Muller twins is technically taken from the comics, but it looks much more like a Power Rangers Megazord in the show, where in the comics it holds more true to the iconic robot look. The fight also ends there in the comics. We don't even get to see the Muller twins take down the bigger robot. Once we get back to William having his emotional moment about Rick, it's another show exclusive. As we talked about, the mood is much more jovial in the comics since William also gets to go to the GDA. Mark having feelings of inadequacy leading to him quitting being a superhero is also a show exclusive. As far as I can tell, he never tries to quit in the comics. Not until like issue 130, but the circumstances are so monumentally different I shouldn't even mention it. Debbie arriving at the GDA and talking to Cecil are show exclusives since she and Cecil never had a conversation before Chicago in the comics. Funnily enough, the slap she gives him may be a reference to issue number 26 because she thinks he's propositioning her for sex, which, to be clear, he's not. The scene of Nolan practicing his speech on top of the mountain is, let's say, inspired by the comics. In issue number 9, Nolan is on top of the mountain and he just repeats "we need to talk" over and over again, not quite what they need to talk about. Nolan returning home to find the GDA agents is a show exclusive, and have I mentioned how fucking cracked Omni-Man is in the show? He's powerful in the comics, but it really is a whole nother level here. Donald dying heroically also doesn't happen in the comics. Actually, there isn't really a scene where Donald dies at all. He reveals that he is in fact a robot, or 98% of one, in issue number 38, but he doesn't say how many times he died, but it definitely wasn't Omni-Man. Eve talking to Mark again doesn't happen until much, much later. Matter of fact, once she leaves for Africa, they don't see each other again until issue number 31, which for those of us keeping track means she hasn't been around in 11 issues since she left in issue number 20. Nolan very angrily asking William where Mark is doesn't happen in the comics. Jeez, I'm gonna get tired of saying that, aren't I? Interestingly, the comics make a point to mention that Eve is specifically in Africa, but the show just says that she has a place a few hundred miles away. Cecil telling the Guardians to stay put is a show exclusive, but Rudy entering Guardians HQ isn't. And in the comics, he's directly introduced by Cecil, not just waltzing in on his own. Notably, Rex Splode is not as pissed at him in the comics, just confused. Cecil and Debbie monitoring Nolan is a show exclusive again. The orbital laser firing on Nolan is a show exclusive. Now back at the Guardians HQ, there's unfortunately no repercussions in the comics for Rudy stealing Rex's blood. The show has it where Monster Girl figures out that Rudy did it for her, but in the comics he directly tells her that he did it for her. No one in the comics really needs much time to process. Black Samson learning about Nolan attacking the world doesn't happen either. There's actually no acknowledgement from the Guardians during the Chicago fight. Cecil shooting Nolan with his literal balls of steel is a show exclusive. Like I said, there's really no resistance from Earth before the Chicago conflict. The Reaniman coming in to attack Nolan is a show exclusive, but using Reaniman to attack Viltrumites is kind of a reference to the comics, although this is probably a closer comparison to what happens in season 3. They're definitely more dangerous in the show though, because they don't even make Mark bleed when he fights him in the comics. Cecil's disgust over D.A. Sinclair is also a show exclusive, while in the comics he was much more interested in making deals with the devil to protect Earth. Nolan and the Kaiju is a show exclusive, or rather their round 2 is. Nolan getting a bloody nose also doesn't happen in the comics. As far as we can tell, he's in... Well, to be clear, there's this giant squid that Omni-Man fights right before getting attacked by the Immortal, but it's not really a fight, it's over in one hit. Or one fly into his ass. Not kidding. They call that the Ant-Man versus Thanos maneuver. The Mauler twins beating the chest of the Immortal to bring him back to life gives us some flashes into his past, which are actually all taken from the origin story at the end of issue number 25. Notably, he was Abraham Lincoln, if you didn't catch that in the show. I'd also like to take a brief moment to talk about the nitpicky details between the collars in the comics and the show. The comic is much more metallic, while in the show it has a much more lightweight metal look to it. Immortal coming for Omni-Man is a pivotal moment in the comics. It happens in issue number 10, but it happens after the Kaiju fight, not during. The choreography isn't much to get excited about. Not to say he's winning by any stretch, but he puts up much more of a fight in the show. The news helicopter is actually how Mark hears about the news, instead of just flying in the same direction as him in the show. Omni-Man killing Immortal in the way he does is directly lifted from the comics, but the news broadcasts say they can't see the fight between the two, so everyone's reaction to the Immortal dying is a show exclusive. The bloodshot eyes on Nolan are also a show exclusive, and finally, lifted directly from the comics are Mark's plea to his dad and Nolan's,
"We need to talk."
My apologies. A small programming error.
And I mean that literally. We'll talk about it soon, but since the Chicago fight only lasts 20 out of the 54 minutes, this episode is actually the penultimate episode of everything the season was building to. Let's begin with Debbie. Her mystery finally reaching a conclusion is such a big part of her part in the finale. Her final confrontation with Nolan about him killing their friends. And he doesn't even give her any real answers. It's chilling and it keeps the mystery until the very finale. She knows more, but not everything. So being so present and on the front lines during the finale is an incredible addition. I think it works significantly better than having her see the fight on TV afterwards or Cecil telling her off screen. She cares for Mark and she cares for Nolan, so seeing the two most important people in her life fight is probably more character building than they could have ever dreamed of giving her. Of course, that's next episode, but it starts here, with her finally getting the confirmation that he did it. Debbie's interactions with Cecil are solid because in the show, the two of them seem to have an overlapping goal. Mark staying alive and being capable enough to stop his father. Of course, Debbie wants them both to be safe and everything, but a halfway alignment isn't that bad. The idea of having a control center spectator room during the Chicago fight and before was a brilliant way to go about it, no matter how you slice it. Which leads me to talking about the before Chicago incident. Remember how we were filing things away in our themes folder for The Earth is Defenseless? This is it. This is why we were filing them all away. It's all been building to this absolute pure show of strength, this display that, if Omni-Man wanted to, he could kill the entire world in an hour. Probably less. I think it's one thing to have Mark and Omni-Man fight, but they're both So not only telling us that Mark is the only hope against Omni-Man, but showing it? Specifically having Cecil throw literally everything he has at him, everything that was a problem for our heroes this season, only to come up short time and time again? Holy shit, does it add way more weight to the Chicago fight. Let me be clear, we'll talk about it more next episode because Chicago is one of the most pivotal moments in Invincible. The last issue of the entire comic references it. So Lance, why isn't that the best episode then? Shut up, stop talking, how did you get in my room? Listen, it's because of the build-up to it, this insane build-up, this acknowledgement that there is literally nothing anyone on the entire planet could do to stop it. It's absolute cinema. Now, a lot had to change to make sure we could get to this point. Very notably Cecil's character. For one, he exists as part of the story now, lol. Some of the story arcs get moved around and speedran for the sake of this episode, and that's okay. I mean, if I had to sacrifice the Sesquid plotline and the Rhiannon plotline and shit, maybe not the Flaxen plotline, but okay, if I had to, I mean, I think it might be worth it. Definitely gotta hand it up to the writers for Cecil's line of,
I'm a good liar. I'm a very good liar.
Because again, on top of everything that this fight means, it's a betrayal of someone you trust. It makes the Chicago fight mean something personal. Let's quickly divest from the good stuff and talk about Amber. I think she has an attitude that really rubs me the wrong way, and maybe that's a personal problem. Everyone can type skill issue in the comments, it's fine. Her feelings are valid in regards to wanting to feel more important and everything, but I don't know, I think I might give Invincible like a little bit more levity than that. Guess it's hard to tell unless you're in it. I think its inclusion in this episode is fine. It doesn't occupy too much screen time, saving room for all of Cecil's attempts to stop Nolan. I've mentioned it briefly, but TV shows are not always guaranteed additional seasons, so it's possible that they're trying to speedrun even Mark's relationship, and having him talk to her in confidence about the situation as a means to an end on that one, I don't know, maybe. It's also kind of neat that Cecil and Debbie can only get in touch with them via her cell phone. It's a good detail, and it's one of those moments about, like, the communication between characters that the show really thinks about. Now, the Mauler and Robot storyline. Firstly, their fight against the Big Boy Robot is fucking awesome. As they almost share, like, a hive mind kind of thing, seeing them work together in battle is really cool. The comics wait until after Angstrom Levy to introduce Rudy, but it makes sense that they would want to get Rudy as functional of a character as they possibly could, as early as they possibly could. He's got a lot of ground to cover, and it's a good change in my opinion. Especially since it gives the Mauler twins some extra motivation. And yeah, I've already talked about the plot hole, so it's fine. Which segues into the Immortal and Omni-Man fight. In the comics, the news reporters say that they're about equally matched, but we the audience know that Omni-Man is significantly stronger than him, in like, literally every way. The choice to make Immortal another obstacle to the kaiju fight is another really great one too, because it puts a lot of tension on Mark specifically, nearly dying from it while the Immortal intervenes. I half expected Adam Eve to like get involved or do something with how many moving parts were at play. Watching it for the first time, I didn't know if the kaiju would do real damage to Nolan or to Mark ahead of what was the inevitable confrontation. I thought a possibility would be that the kaiju would like hurt Nolan enough for Mark to put up a fight, but nope, we literally get the strongest being in the entire show and comics fighting up on a teenager, Lamau. I feel like I really enjoyed this episode because so many important details got lifted from the comics while the stuff that wasn't is absolute cinema. Completely incredible as far as new stuff goes, and there was a lot of it. And the reason this is the best episode is that all the theme building we were doing about Earth being defenseless paid off big time here, which to me, as a human,
one of the idiots who lives in it,
I care a great deal about. I'm an empathetic person, so I can put myself in the shoes of watching two literal gods destroy an entire world, and that shit's scary. It's also interesting because all the work we put into Nolan's humanity kinda gets put on pause here, to be saved for the next episode when that one pays off big time. Same with the Mark is not invincible theme. So literally by the numbers, the next episode pays off more thematically than this episode, but I just feel like the amount of work that went into Earth is Defenseless is more than the others, so I still count it as the best episode. It kind of feels like those recap episodes where it's like, hey, remember the Rhiannon? Hey, remember the kaiju? That's right, folks, we're bringing them back. The character stuff is generally really solid, even if it spends way too much time focusing on the characters I care the least about. I get it, Mark's personal life is a really big deal, but it just seems like there's, I don't know, bigger things happening right now. And with all that said, let's finally move on to the big boy.
You're fighting so you can watch everyone around you die. Think, Mark.
The episode starts with the Immortal's body hitting the ground, and good old Dad gives Mark the "we need to talk" like he's about to tell him where babies come from. Mark, dazed and confused, swings first on Omni-Man. He thinks Nolan is being controlled, but Nolan very calmly, in an extremely eerie way, clarifies that he's just being himself. Nolan explains where he really comes from, being Viltrum, except not the perfect utopia he described. Well, yes, a perfect utopia, but one paved in blood. That's right, we're talking eugenics, baby! Nolan explains that once he was born, he joined the war effort, and helped wipe out other species, showing glimpses of Alan's species, the Unopans. But their territory spreading them thin, they elected to instead conquer planets by weakening their defenses one Viltrumite at a time, which explains why he had to kill the Guardians. He says he kept it secret from Debbie all this time, and then we get back to the present. He tries to enlist Mark, and Mark cries, being half human after all. Little baby Mark here just kinda sad that he was lied to. Nolan clarifies that he had to wait until he was sure that Mark was a Viltrumite, and Mark sees right through that shit, realizing that eugenics are bad. He studied the Holocaust via his Earth education, so of course he thinks that. Nolan explains that Mark is nearly full-blooded Viltrumite, and he'll live for thousands of years. Then he tries to appeal to Mark's humanity by telling him that he can make life better for the people on Earth. Nolan unfortunately steps a little too far and loses all credibility he was gaining with Mark by telling him that Debbie is a little bit more than a pet to him than a wife. We have this really emotional interaction where Nolan tries to physically connect with his son just to be swatted away, and it's actually really heartbreaking. And then their fight begins. Nolan slams Mark around. Guys, Nolan is fucking cracked in this show, and it's revealed that Cecil and the GDA are watching them through the cameras, as well as Deb. Suddenly, attacking New Guardians HQ, reiterating that their orders were to stay out of it. Rudy encourages everybody to listen to Cecil's orders, and then Eve arrives at the HQ as well. Rudy gives us our setup for the title card.
He'll need to be...
Oh geez, what a stinker to go out on. It sucks that the last name drop in the season is gonna sit in C tier, but I mean, look at the ones it's up against. Mark pleads with his father, but you can see in his eyes that Nolan thinks he's a weak Viltrumite. And we all know what happens to weak Viltrumites. The jets get scrambled and we get the incredible...
Look what they need to mimic a fraction of our power.
Like, fucking incredible. I cannot overstate how incredibly awesome this line is. And scary. Nolan explains that pity is acceptable for humans but not value. The jets open fire, and aside from some flames, Omni-Man is unscathed. He instantly flies through the jet and explodes it. It takes Mark a bit to save him, but he gets him back on the ground safely, just in time for Omni-Man to show up and congratulate him. Before he does this, Nolan says that there's so much effort wasted, and to be honest, just with the numbers, he's right. It actually takes 5 seconds for him to demolish the jet, and it takes Mark exactly 25 seconds to save the pilot. We know Mark isn't quite as strong as Omni-Man, and saving is harder than killing, but the show illustrates this really well by having the real-life time difference.
Bravo!
Also important to note that while the show has definitely played around with gore before, this is by far the most violent episode, outside of maybe the Guardian slaughter in episode 1, also, once again, by Omni-Man. It seems like humanity as a whole is less brutal than Nolan is by himself. Anyway, Nolan doesn't even react, just chasing the other jet. Mark manages to intercept, and Nolan punches him all the way into Chicago. He thinks that Mark is soft by being disturbed by the crushing of the man's skull, so it seems like he's going to callous over his emotions by demolishing the third largest city in the United States. The initial hit to the city causes tremendous damage, and to follow up more on what I said earlier, Mark himself is causing the damage, albeit inadvertently. And the gore isn't nearly as toned up as what Nolan does with Mark's body in a few minutes. Wait, that sounds weird. A large building begins to fall into the city, and Mark puts all his effort into saving it. He puts most of his effort into saving this one family that he can visibly see, until the building falls and he realizes he couldn't save them anyway. Nolan comes in and blames the destruction on Mark, which would be like blaming the murder on the gun itself. Debbie explodes from hearing Nolan say that in the grand scheme of things, her life is worthless. I can really understand being heartbroken by hearing someone you love with all your heart say something like that. But in the grand scheme of things, really? Pull yourself together, Debbie. Mark really takes this to heart, though, and actually gets some solid hits on Nolan when he wasn't expecting it. It doesn't last very long, though, as Nolan gets a grip and strikes back. He hits him into the subway where he uses his face to demolish a train full of people, Mark's flailing arms only causing more damage as the train whips by. Once again, more brutality caused by Nolan than anyone else in the show. Earth truly is defenseless, huh? Mark pleads that Nolan was happy here on Earth.
Sure, I was happy. For a time.
But he says that he's loyal to Viltrum in the end, not Earth. Mark tries to punch him again, but this time Nolan matrixes himself out of harm's way, not going to be caught off guard again. Nolan drags Mark way above the clouds, saying more horrible things about humanity, and Mark slams his fist directly into him and he doesn't even flinch. Cracked. He then punches Mark quite a few times, before claiming Mark's true education begins now, as Nolan regrets raising him as a human. We get a small interlude scene here where Black Samson gathers the Guardians to go save lives in Chicago, even if not confront Omni-Man directly. Monster Girl reminds Rudy that he's not a robot, and he can't blindly listen to Cecil's orders. Nolan then slams Mark into a mountaintop, causing an avalanche that kills a small village. Nolan picks him up out of the snow and just keeps wailing on him. I'll talk more about the dialogue in the comic section, don't worry. As he pummels him, he remembers back to a time when Mark was little and he was playing a baseball game, and his parents were watching. Debbie encourages him to be a good father, helping Nolan see the humanity of raising a child. She helps him support his son, and even though he's resistant, he does. Back to the present, he thinks about the past. He falls over and resets with his son for a moment. Suddenly, anger. He says his famous,
"Think, Mark!"
To which he asks,
"What will you have after 500 years?"
And Mark responds,
"I still have you."
Nolan looks at his hands, kind of realizing what he's done. Mark pleads with his father one last time, and he flies off. Brings a tear to my eye. And Mark's, actually. And Omni-Man's, actually. Cecil and Debbie arrive via the helicopter to provide Mark some medical attention. Debbie is utterly destroyed, and we get a montage of the relevant players watching the news of Chicago. William, Art, then the Muller twins. They torch their warehouse and then get arrested once more after they step outside. Now Amber is watching the footage from Chicago, and we see the new Guardians begin to pick up the pieces. Mark wakes from his small coma where his mom is waiting for him. She says she's proud of him before leaving, and Cecil fills Debbie in on what happened. Well, what the cover-up is. Nolan Grayson died when the house across the street exploded. He said he's going to pump up the sales of Nolan's books so that they will be taken care of financially. Debbie asks why, and Cecil feels responsible for not seeing this move coming, and wants to make it right. The new Guardians return from their rescue efforts in Chicago, and Rex, of all people, begins cleaning up the bloodstain left on the wall. Black Samson tries to tell him that they haven't earned it yet, but everyone else seems to disagree. And now, they're a team. We get a montage of life seemingly returning to normal. Amber and William back in school, Mark recovering, Chicago being rebuilt, and even the new Guardians training as a team. Art reminisces on his friendship with Nolan, and then lets it go. Eve sits alone, all the good stuff. William goes into Mark's house to try to tidy the mail up for them, and he runs into Eve. William accidentally reveals that Mark is invincible, but that's okay because Eve knows too. Cecil has a conversation with Mark after he finally wakes up after 2 weeks in a coma. He asks him if he wants to be a hero again. Mark says he's not sure, and Cecil takes him to the White Room. To quickly run through this, apparently there's a chemical in the water that Americans drink that disallows them to see certain frequencies of light, hence the White Room. So drink up, kiddies. Cecil clarifies that Nolan has left Earth, and he may be leaving for good. They then talk about having a replacement, and that may be being Mark. The Grayson family returns to their home, and Cecil continues to be extremely sympathetic towards their family. Mark notices a picture of his dad, remembers all the great moments they had throughout the season. Super duper cute. And then we get some dialogue about Mark needing to do the things he doesn't want to do, now in a new context. The memories begin catching up to him, and he has a small bit of PTSD about Chicago. Mark notices his mother in tears after everything that's happened, and then Amber visits Mark, and instantly forgives him, which is nice. She says that she pieced together that Omni-Man was his dad, and she asks if he wants to talk about it, to which he says yeah, he does. They get interrupted by William and Eve, though, and everybody exchanges the wait, they know kind of words. There's a nice scene with Art talking to Debbie about Nolan's betrayal. The kids eat at Burger Mart, everybody apologizes, and Mark tries to talk about it, but decides against it, trying to talk about something else.
We can try, but it's literally all anyone is talking about in the whole world.
Lamau, thanks William. Mark is pulled away by Cecil for his first mission, something headed towards Earth, very fast. There's this thought that it might be Omni-Man, but that doesn't stop Mark from immediately getting up to space. Eve then reveals to Amber and William that she's Adam Eve and gets shrugged off as a joke. Do you children realize what her powers are? Nobody takes her powers seriously, and it's gonna drive me up the fucking wall. Mark gets up there, and it's Alan again, just barely not punching the shit out of him. Alan warns Mark that there's a Viltrumite on his planet, then explains it all to Alan. Alan sympathizes and casually drops that his species has breeding camps, lol. He mentions that Mark's inclusion might turn the tide in the war. Alan warns that the Viltrumites will be back for Earth, and we get a sneak preview of some loose ends, including the Sesquids, Flaxens, Muller twins, and Pete, he's okay, Titan, Battle Beast, and Cecil's Reaniman. When asked what he's gonna do next, and faced with all of these loose ends, Mark iconically says,
"Finish high school, I guess."
Oh, alright, good. Sounds good.
Final one here, folks. The episode title, Where I Really Come From, comes from issue number 11, when Nolan tells Mark about his true Viltrumite origins. Let me say as a precursor that this episode has a lot of overlap with the comics, like especially in the dialogue 1-to-1, so this is going to be fun. It also feels worth noting that the beginning of the Chicago event starts at dusk and goes well into the night, whereas in the show it starts earlier in the day and has it end closer to dusk. So Omni-Man most definitely karate chops the Immortal in the comics, issue number 10, but Mark doesn't swing on Omni-Man at all. Instead, they cold open issue number 11 with Nolan telling Mark where he comes from. It's worth noting that when he tells him the lie of where they come from in issue number 2, the framing of the page is almost identical to the first page of issue number 11, with a crap ton of words overlapping too. Really neat stuff. After this revelation, Mark doesn't think that Omni-Man is being controlled by something, so that's a show exclusive. Nolan's calmness about the situation is fairly translated, I mean, as well as you can write he said calmly into a comic issue. The explanation of where he comes from is almost 1-to-1 at certain points, so...
It's time for you to know where I really come from. I am from Viltrum, but it's not the planet I've told you about. We have created a perfect civilization, but it took all of our strength to get there. In order for our people to reach their full potential, we had to remove the weak from our society. It was a long and difficult process. Our population was cut in half, but what emerged from the ashes was unstoppable. By the time I was born, Viltrum was already the greatest empire in our galaxy. Once I was old enough, I joined the war effort. But as our territory grew, our forces were stretched thin and our expansion stopped. We needed a better, more efficient way to conquer worlds. Our most trusted officers were each given a planet to weaken by themselves. I was one of those lucky few.
The beginning part of his speech is taken from multiple different panels, nearly all on page 2 of issue number 11. Nolan mentions that he was born into a bustling empire a few pages later, not in the beginning of the story. The comics make it so that the Viltrumites become a planetary empire, while the show makes it the only empire in the galaxy. Nolan talks about joining the war effort in the show, but in the comic he just talks about the formation of the World Conquering Committee and the details and stages that go into that. Step 1, locating worlds in a good stage of development, or worlds whose defenses would be worthwhile in overcoming. Step 2, establishing a watchtower to keep supplies for the efforts. And Step 3 would be establishing contact. The comic makes it a point to mention that the races who complied were given technology to improve their life, and those who didn't were not looked on so favorably. The same aliens are used in this part of the speech too, so that's cool. The comics make note that the Viltrumites enlist aid of the conquered species to expand their empire, which is notably lacking in Season 1, but it does happen in Season 2. He mentions that the World Conquering Committee became the most popular profession, and Nolan joined when he came of age, same as the show. The comics detail the specifics of his journey, starting at the Search Committee and attending auditions for 3 years before being selected for the Conquering Committee. committee. We get more details about the species he slaughtered and how he rose through the ranks of Viltrum, eventually leading to his own division of soldiers. He stopped every species that stood in his way, including the Unopans, much like the show. Nolan then talks about how the expansion efforts stopped, same as the show, and instead of showing in one force, one Viltrumite would be chosen for the undercover assignment, and Nolan was one of the first chosen for this assignment. He says it was the closest thing to a vacation that existed on Viltrum. Now, a rather big departure from the show is that the comic goes into much greater detail on Nolan's first days here on Earth, surveying and accepting that life among the humans was his mission. He says that he settled into a routine of stopping world-ending event after world-ending event, even showing a panel of him fending off Alan. Eventually, once he saved Debbie, he decided to live as a human with her. And in the show, we cut back to the present and that's the end of the story. But the comics go into much greater depth about Nolan's journey. He explains that working for money is an alien concept to him, then going into detail about the benefits of communism. That's a joke, he doesn't actually do that. He talks about making love rather than just procreating and becoming a regular with the superhero community. He mentions that he was living the lie a little too well, and he talks about his relationship with them. Red Rush helped him with his costume, and he says that he would even become friends with them. But he knew that they could never understand his mission and would eventually need to be eliminated. Everything changed when Mark was born though, as he initially had the instinct to take him someplace secluded and train him on his own. But instead, he saw how happy Debbie was with the baby and decided not to. Nolan even says he tried to distance himself emotionally from her but could never bring himself to do it. The moment in the show when he talks about hiding the truth from Debbie is actually this panel in the comics of issue number 11. Nolan says that he knew once Mark developed his powers, this new life he loved couldn't last, and that's when he struck the Guardians. And last note on this, look how great the art overlaps for the live version of the story and the truth version of the story. It's pretty wonderful. Are you ready to move on to minute number 3 of the show, everyone? Now in the show, we get back to the present, and the conversation still overlaps pretty heavily with issue number 11 on page 17 after Nolan is done telling Mark the truth.
This doesn't make any sense. You love Mom. I know you do.
Do you have any idea how long we live? The older we get, the slower we age. Viltrumite DNA is so pure, you're nearly full-blooded. You'll live for thousands of years. Do you understand what that means? Everyone you know and love will be gone before you even look 30. Your mother, she's more like a pet. This is the only way, Mark.
Don't touch me.
Calm down.
I will not calm down. This is insane. What do you think is gonna happen? That I'm gonna go enslave my friends for a bunch of aliens I've never met? This is my life. These are my people.
We have a responsibility to Viltrum.
I don't give a shit about Viltrum. And I don't care if I live a fucking million years. This is my home, and I won't let you destroy it.
You don't know what you're saying. I can't let you interfere.
I know exactly what I'm saying.
So be it.
The part about Mark realizing that he'd be just one more human is a show-exclusive part of the conversation, though. The part of his speech where he talks about improving Earth is actually entirely show-exclusive. In the comics, he just mentions that Earth is a valuable resource and he wants it for the Empire. Nolan mentioning that Debbie feels more like a pet to him is actually earlier in the conversation, not quite used as the straw that breaks Mark's back as it is in the show. Nolan's first hit on Mark is the first panel of issue number 12. Except in the comics, he hits him directly into Chicago. The altercation with the Jets is entirely a show-exclusive, and what an inclusion, because I swear,
look what they need to mimic a fraction of our power.
Is just too good to pass up. Literally everything that happens that isn't about the Chicago fight is a show exclusive. The conversations with Debbie and Cecil, even Rex, Rudy and Black Samson, none of it is in the comics. Issue number 12 starts with the Chicago fight and ends in the mountains. The Chicago fight is severely reduced in runtime, or comic panels I guess, and not nearly as graphic. The specifics of such a monumental fight were not carried over exactly, and naturally a lot of the fight itself is a show exclusive. Mark trying to save the family in the building doesn't happen, and him standing up to Omni-Man is actually the first thing that happens in their fight. It also, as mentioned before, is the first time in the comics that Mark actually bleeds. The conversation the two have is slightly different. Nolan's conversation about the futility of human lives happens in the comics, but it's directly referenced as a waste.
How could you say those things? How could you say that about Mom? Liar!
For the first time in your life, I'm telling you the truth. These people are meaningless.
You're wrong. I've seen you save people. Maybe you were a Viltrumite when you came to Earth, but you've changed. You were happy here.
Sure, I was happy for a time, but I'm loyal to Viltrum, not this pathetic excuse for a civilization. You aren't listening, Mark. My time here has been a speck in the span of my life. You don't know me. I will burn this planet down before I spend another minute living among these animals.
Mark's punch on Omni-Man happens here in the comics, but Nolan doesn't tank it, he actually reacts. Mark hitting back at the frustration is 1-to-1, however he doesn't actually land any punches in the comics, just the show. He does hit him into the subway, but it's the initial hit that derails and destroys the subway cars, not Mark's face as in the show. The sentiment of Nolan's speech about humans being cavemen is echoed in the comics, except in the comics he refers to them as livestock. In the subway, Nolan confirms that he was happy, but in the comics he pulls him into the sky and talks to him about it then. Nolan telling Mark he was wrong to raise him as a human is a reference to this panel in issue number 11, which we talked about during his flashback. In the show, he crashes through a cruise liner, but in the comic, he just hits him into the open ocean. Hitting Mark into a mountain and all the choreography that follows is almost 1-to-1, but most of the dialogue is taken right from the comics.
Had enough yet?
I'll stop you.
I'm ready when you are. You're doing this for nothing. Being a part of the Empire will make Earth better than it ever was.
And what if they resist?
That's why we're here. To keep them from resisting, or die.
I won't let you.
I can always start again. Make another kid.
Notably in the show, Nolan punches Mark into a mountaintop devoid of snow, but in the comics they're still on the same icy mountaintop. The line of,
"What's 17 more years? I can always start again. Make another kid,"
has its origins in the line when Nolan says, "I can always produce more offspring." Not quite as dramatic of a line as in the show. In the comics, Nolan punches Mark while screaming, "Why?" And in the show, we flash back to Nolan and Debbie watching Mark as a young child. This is actually from one panel in the story of Where I Come From in issue number 11, although there's no dialogue in the comic. Back to the present, in the comics, Nolan doesn't collapse next to his son. We do get one panel of his fist shaking, but it's at the end of the fight immediately before he takes off.
"Why did you make me do this? You're fighting so you can watch everyone around you die. Think, Mark! You'll outlast every fragile, insignificant being on this planet. You'll live to see this world crumble to dust and blow away. Everyone and everything you know will be gone. What will you have after 500 years?
You, Dad. I still have you.
Notably, Mark says "Dad" twice, once before he flies away and once after, and Nolan tearing up as he flies into space is also in this panel. The GDA arriving to pick up Mark is the first panel of issue number 13. Debbie and Cecil are not present, however. The montage of all the relevant players watching the news is also represented in these panels, but Amber is missing, instead replaced with Adam Eve, who is still attending school and hasn't left for Africa yet. Debbie taking care of Mark is only represented in one panel in issue number 13, but her talking to Cecil is represented in the comics. It's a bit out of order from Cecil's first talk with Mark, but it's in issue number 13. A lot of the dialogue matches up, but it's not as interesting, so I'll just sum it up. In the comics, the cover-up says that Nolan died in a car crash because the house explosion scene with Donald doesn't happen in the comics. Debbie asks him why in the comics, as Cecil wasn't a figure known by Debbie in the comics up until this point. The scene about the new Guardians HQ is a show exclusive. I've searched far and wide, but the bonding aspects of the new team is just not very prominent in the comics. The montage of life going back to normal is kind of similar to the montage we saw earlier, sans the training montage. The scene where Eve runs into William outside of Mark's house is actually pretty 1-to-1. The scene where Mark wakes up and talks to Cecil is in the comics, although it's split into two scenes. The first one lines up pretty well, but it has a lot more dialogue from Cecil, as this is his first time actually meeting Mark. The White Room has much more little things to see in the show version, but a good centerpiece is the Immortal being patched up in the comic and being examined in the show. A lot of the general conversation is carried over, but not word for word. The White Room, Debbie hearing the conversation, Nolan's trajectory away from Earth, all leading up to,
"We need a replacement."
Mark saying no, however, is a show exclusive. He's pretty on board to work with Cecil from the very next panel in the comics. The scene of Mark and Debbie returning home is also from issue number 13, although the memories and the PTSD that he gets are show exclusive. Amber coming to the door to see Mark is a show exclusive. In issue number 14, she gives him a big kiss and mentions that she hasn't seen him since his dad died in that car crash. But she doesn't know he's invincible yet, so there's no extended conversation like in the show. William and Eve arriving to see Mark is also show exclusive. In the comics, however, they do have their own scene where Eve mentions to William that her friend is working on finding Invincible, and they go out on a date. They do end up dating briefly in the comics because, as I mentioned before, William doesn't end up coming out as gay until issue number 80. The scene of Art and Debbie at his tailor shop is a show exclusive. I mean, kind of a show exclusive. They do have a conversation about Nolan in issue number 22. And either way, the scene has roots set in issue number 14, when Art visits Debbie at her house. The Burger Mart scene is a show exclusive as well. Mark does get called to fly into space, but it's immediately after he returns home. And the conversation is different since he said no to Cecil in the show, but not in the comics. Mark flies into space, and notably he has his costume on underneath his clothes in the show, but not in the comics. Alan returning happens at the end of issue number 13, and Alan arrives before Mark does, getting hit, not avoiding it like the show. The conversation lines up really closely with the comics, but it's not really all that interesting, so I'm gonna skip it again. There's no teaser for upcoming plotlines in the comics because Kirkman actually thought this might be the last issue. I'll talk about that in a bit. And the very last panel of issue number 13 is...
Finish high school, I guess.
What is high school?
Now it's all out and you know.
Oh boy, where to begin? Let's start here. The show includes a lot of cutting away from the Chicago fight to show off the stuff with the New Guardians as well as Debbie and Cecil. It's rather uncommon for shows to have a fight and not do any kind of cutting away from them at all, otherwise you get fatigued from watching the same thing all the way through. So this isn't necessarily a surprise, but as I mentioned, it is unique to the show, and even then it's very minimal, allowing these two titans to really just go at it. The choice of the New Guardians is definitely to wrap up their We Haven't Earned It Yet arc that they had going. The comics didn't go this angle with the New Guardians at all, and I think it had to do with establishing different things during the first 13 issues. More on that later, but for now I'll say that the show can't just build up two characters, you know? It's gotta put more stock into letting other minor characters and background characters grow as well. The stuff with Debbie is obviously because number one, Sandra Oh is a great actress, as is Wilton Goggins, and giving them expanded roles in this fight is a great way to have them get more screen time. It's also important to note that Cecil is a massive player in the Invincible world, both in the comics and in the show, and Debbie didn't really become a character until issue number 14 anyway. So similar to Rudy, giving them a chance to develop more as a character during this time is a good choice. It's also important to note that having Debbie and Cecil, the two people closest to Nolan, save for art maybe, observe and commentate on the Chicago fight really makes it personal. It's obviously a huge deal that Omni-Man is crushing Chicago under his fist, or his son's face more specifically, but to have the two closest people to him feel personally betrayed by it, like they were lied to, like they failed, it hits heavier, you know? Aside from that, we've got some specifics to talk about. So let's start at the beginning, the actual beginning it seems.
Well, let's do this one last time.
Nolan spends the first 2 minutes and 25 seconds talking about his Viltrumite origins, whereas in the comic he spends 16 out of 21 pages talking about them. So you can do the conversion math if you really want. As mentioned, they're far more in-depth in the comics, but let's be fair here, there's also the flashback that takes up another 1 minute and 55 seconds when Nolan is beating the shit out of his son. The first flashback is about Viltrum, and the second is about his humanity. Hey, wait, is that the themes folder right here? So Nolan having a flashback in the middle of beating up his son is obviously points for his humanity, and I'm kinda split on which did it better. The comics had ongoing words and emotions really piling up before the fight, pages on pages about how he was adapting to life on Earth, and he couldn't distance himself due to his love for his wife. Whereas the show had J.K. Simmons, the man who can carry a performance far as fuck, with animation making it come to life, so which is better? I don't know, really. It's really hard to pick a decisive winner. The comics had Nolan be a good father for the first 7 issues, and then even then, he wasn't really that cold or distant of a person. Not like he is when he's forcing himself to do it in the show. So you could read this as, he just snapped and he was always this way, which the comic goes on to believe, or it wasn't built up. The show, meanwhile, has him bouncing back and forth between being a good human father and a cold, calculating murderer. I guess that's points for the show, but something about him fighting his humanity for the entire issue, something he spent the entire comic run building, it just kinda feels better to me. Maybe it has to do with the flashback during the fight. In the comics, it's kind of an impulsive decision to leave Earth, but in the show, he kinda thinks about it beforehand, reflecting on his humanity. Is it better or worse? I really don't know. Like, I really can't pin it down. I'm actually gonna leave that to you guys to decide. I think both mediums had some interesting work done for this theme, so with all that evidence, I guess I'll just leave it up to you guys. But much like the last episode, this is the episode where Nolan's humanity really shines as its theme. We can remember all the fun times he threw the ball with Mark and let him run to his girlfriend and truly cared about Debbie as he pounds Mark's face into the pavement. All those past moments come back to pay off in this finale, and I really do think it works. The effort put into this is solid no matter which version you like. While we're mucking about in the themes folder, let's quickly pull out the Earth is Defenseless one. Cecil makes it very known to both the Guardians and the GDA that he has no way to really stop Omni-Man, and the scenes before Chicago with the Jets is just peak. One last attempt to take down Nolan before he crushes everything. Because let's be honest, Chicago isn't just a city, it's a symbol. It's this idea that we have nothing that we can do to stop Omni-Man. The show obviously plays up this theme far more than the comics do. It's not really a facet in the comics aside from Cecil, well, existing at all. But the show really takes this idea and runs with it, especially with the gruesomeness. Some of the most brutal panels in the comic are actually Viltrumite on Viltrumite battles, which I think makes sense in general, but Nolan brings this Viltrumite brutality to the people of Earth, crushing skulls with his bare hand, flattening survivors on the subway. It's honestly a little existentially terrifying seeing this theme come out so realistically in the show, being one of the small little ants that do live on this blue marble. The show builds up this theme all season and it really comes alive in episode 7, but finally reaches its peak in the Chicago fight. Every turn, with Mark not being able to save the family in the building to him not being able to stop himself from destroying the subway, it's far, far more impactful than Nolan's rampage in the comics. It's a good theme because it hangs around the background for the entire fight and there's really no avoiding it. The thought that Omni-Man could destroy an entire planet and there's really nothing anybody could do to stop him, it's terrifying. It shit keeps me up at night. especially after what we saw him do to the Flaxans. Now, speaking of Mark's face, our last theme, Mark isn't invincible. Obviously, he lives through the fight, and I'm not even talking about the thrashing he takes from his father on the mountains. But in Chicago himself, he's defenseless. He has no way to stop Nolan from using him as a weapon against the humans he's been saving his entire career. That combined with the emotional weight of seeing your actions have no effect on stopping a force such as his dad, it's easy to see the emotional weight of this fight come to full force. It's no wonder that when Mark says, "How can you do that?" it's through tears. With those three themes in mind, can you see why this is an extremely satisfying finale? Why make these changes? Well, because they're fucking awesome, that's why. I'm gonna talk broadly here, so forgive me for any actuallys you may leave in the comments, but comics tend to forego central themed plots and focus more on character arcs. The main theme of Invincible is more so how do you handle power responsibly, but even then they shift direction quite a lot, so I guess the main theme could be you don't know when it's gonna end or how it's gonna end. It's kinda similar to The Walking Dead now that I think about it. Anyway, the themes present in the show don't really have much overlap in the comic. Maybe Nolan's humanity, but not to this degree. Themes are important to shows and movies because they tell the story of an idea through the story that's actually being told. So it's natural that the show would explore these themes in greater detail than the comics. I think the show really overperforms in these aspects. Cecil's involvement in the show from episode 1 also reinforces the part of the Earth is defenseless theme. I mean, he honestly kind of started that theme and then he keeps tacking onto it as we go. All of the finale scenes with him are awesome in their own right, especially with Walton Goggins' performance. The heart and soul that went into every character's performance really makes this a show that stands out among others. And of course, the source material brought it all together. But in these three themes, I think this episode really shows up. And I think these themes do their job just in their name alone to convey what exactly they stand for. Shows can have a lot of different themes, but when you talk about themes this big, this existential, this large on a universal scale, the show really does them justice.
Which means we need a replacement.
What a damn series, truly. I've mentioned it before, but let's start with this. Kirkman thought that this would be the end of Invincible. He saw that as his comic sales went down for Invincible, he might as well put a good cap on it and have this huge dramatic 180 for everybody who was enjoying the comics. But as the final issues were coming out, the sales actually picked up on issue number 12. Way to beat the buzzer, geez. And Kirkman saw a future for Invincible again. So that's probably why there aren't any teasers for upcoming villains in issue number 13. Nolan being evil was the plan from issue number 1, but it was going to be a way slower rollout than we got. Which is obviously an advantage that the show has over in the comics in that regard, especially with such an explosive finale to end the first episode. So, the series as a whole. Every episode in the show gets its name from a panel in the comics, but only a few episodes actually say the title of the name in each episode, those being It's About Time, We Need to Talk, and Where I Really Come From. I truly wish that the show did more with the Damien Darkblood storyline. It felt like the detective plotline in Squid Games, where it was neat while it was happening, but it didn't really lead to anything tangible. I respect what his plotline did for the other characters, but I don't know, man, I liked him. I wish he had a bigger part. While some character interactions are changed due to his presence, one thing that I wish could have had lasting consequences was a distrust of Cecil for knowing and not sharing from Debbie. After all, if Cecil knew what Nolan was capable of and didn't try to evacuate Debbie from the situation, I mean, it's kind of fucked. Now, there wasn't even an investigation in the comics, so I guess it's a net positive that there was something in the show, but I don't know. I talked a lot of smack throughout the series about the show speedrunning long-running events between the Flaxans, Titan, the Reanimen. I've said that I wish they took their time with these things before. I understand the format that we're working with here, so I somewhat understand why they couldn't, but I do think that it's a net negative to the series overall. It was a little piece of candy to see an enemy that we haven't seen in a while randomly pop up in the middle of an issue that had nothing to do with them, and it's an opportunity that the show missed. Series these days, but Amazon shows specifically, are written an entire season at a time, so it's not like they had to figure out what the next episode would be on a week-to-week basis. I'm a little disappointed that they didn't divide these big events up and sprinkle them in bit by bit throughout the season, but I understand the format, and hey, they probably know better than me. To talk quickly about each episode individually, the Flaxan episode stands out for what it does to Nolan, and really enhancing his evil side. The Reanimen stand out for their part in episode 7, aka the best episode in the season, and the Titan episode stands out for the shock value of seeing Mark nearly die. I think each episode really has a spark that makes it something great, like Alan in episode 2 showing that there are other forces in play throughout the galaxy. I don't think any episode is bad, especially because it really is just all pointing towards the same story, and the same finale. Kirkman has said he wanted to make every issue feel like it was the end of the world, where you'd think they'd never actually turn Las Vegas into glass, which they did, by the way, issue number 80. So the element of surprise was a really important note for the comics, which is why I think it was rather difficult for the comics to stick to a main theme. I mean, part of the long-running theme is the proper use of power, but it didn't really begin paying dividends until, like, issue 100. Most of the work they did for the characters specifically was well-deserved and warranted in the show. Acceleration isn't a bad thing when you're going over storylines that take literal decades. Having such tangible themes is another really solid note for the show. Picking one, or three, elements to really dig into and expand on is a really wonderful process, and I'm glad that they went about it this way. And without even going into them, you can absolutely tell what their role in the story is. Nolan's humanity, Earth is defenseless, Mark's not invincible. It's really great work. Now, with all that, there's one more thing that I'd like to talk about, on kind of an upbeat note. I have lied to you all. We've been talking this whole time about our 3 central themes, and they're really solid, but we've got to talk about this last one. Mark is not invincible. Every piece we've thrown into this theme has a double meaning. Let's start with Battle Beast. Mark lives through that fight, so already he is invincible, I suppose. But let's look closer. How does he live through that fight? Firstly, it was the New Guardians, with basically their dying breath that fended off Battle Beast from finishing off Invincible. Next, it was Cecil and the GDA that helped put Mark's insides, well, back inside. In the same episode, it was Eve who helped shoulder the lies to Amber about Mark's disappearance from the soup kitchen. An episode later, with the Rihanna men, it was William's plea to Rick that turned the tide in what could have been a deadly conflict. And lastly, it wasn't Mark's strength that saved him from Omni-Man, it was his humanity and connective tissue with his father that broke through to Nolan. Being invincible was never about his strength or his health, his speed or his agility. This theme isn't about doing it on your own, and especially in the first season, Mark doesn't. He uses his friends, his allies, his experiences, and his humanity, and he overcomes. So yes, I lied to you with this theme, because if you look throughout the show, you don't have evidence of Mark not being able to handle it. You get instance after instance of Mark Grayson, with the help of his friends, truly being